Have you ever wondered about those perplexing whispers of the past, the ancient mysteries that seem to cling to the very air we breathe? Sometimes, history feels less like a neatly organized timeline and more like a vast, dusty attic filled with forgotten stories and enigmatic figures. And among these figures, few loom larger or remain quite so mysterious as the Huns. They swept across continents like a storm, leaving behind a trail of awe, terror, and surprisingly few definitive answers. Their very name conjures images of wild horsemen and swift conquest, yet their origins remain a topic of intense scholarly debate, like trying to trace the source of a massive ancient river from a single drop of water. Where did they truly come from? How did this seemingly unstoppable force materialize out of the depths of the Eurasian steppe to reshape the destiny of empires? These aren't just dry historical facts. They're the echoes of an ancient enigma that still tantalizes us today. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're listening in, why not drop a comment with your location and local time? It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. Now, as the sun begins its slow descent, let us journey back to a time when the world was vast and largely uncharted by the settled civilizations of the West, to the very cradle of a people who would, for a time, hold sway over a significant portion of it. The origins of the Huns, you see, are shrouded in the mists of antiquity, a puzzle composed of fragmented accounts and archaeological whispers. While no definitive historical record explicitly names their birthplace or initial tribal affiliations with absolute certainty, the prevailing scholarly consensus points eastward, deep into the heart of the East Asian steppes. This immense grassland, stretching for thousands of miles, had long been a crucible for nomadic peoples, a harsh yet fertile ground for the development of highly mobile equestrian cultures. Think of it as nature's own express highway for horseback riders, where entire societies could pack up and move at a moment's notice. The earliest glimpses we have of a people resembling the Huns come from ancient Chinese records, specifically those describing a formidable nomadic confederation known as the Xiongnu. For centuries, the Xiongnu were the bane of the Han dynasty, launching relentless raids across the northern borders, demanding tribute and generally making life rather difficult for the emperors, who, much like modern-day commuters stuck in traffic, just wanted a quiet journey. The Great Wall of China, that monumental testament to human perseverance and perhaps stubbornness, was largely built as a direct response to the persistent threat posed by these very Xiongnu. They were master archers, riding small but incredibly sturdy horses, and their tactics of swift raids and elusive retreats made them incredibly difficult to pin down. They didn't build grand cities or elaborate monuments. Their legacy was etched into the fear they inspired and the vast distances they covered. Historians still argue whether the Xiongnu and the Huns were one and the same people, or if the Huns were simply a successor group emerging from the remnants of the Xiongnu Confederacy after its eventual decline and dispersal. It's a bit like trying to decide if the modern-day descendants of a sprawling family are the exact same family that lived 1,000 years ago, or merely very, very distant cousins with a similar surname and a knack for horseback riding. Some scholars suggest a direct lineage, a continuous migration westward as the Xiongnu faced internal strife and pressure from other nomadic groups and the resurgent Chinese states. Others propose a more complex picture, suggesting that the Huns were a new ethnogenesis, a mix of various steppe peoples who over time coalesced under a new, powerful leadership, perhaps even absorbing some of the Xiongnu's traditions and martial prowess. Regardless of the precise genealogical link, the military and social characteristics described by Roman and Greek writers about the Huns bore a striking resemblance to those attributed to the Xiongnu in Chinese texts. Exceptional horsemanship, deadly accurate composite bows, and a fearsome, almost supernatural ability to appear seemingly out of nowhere. It's safe to say they weren't exactly known for their polite dinner invitations. These early nomadic groups, from which the Huns are believed to have sprung, lived a life dictated by the seasons and the needs of their livestock. Their wealth wasn't measured in gold or fixed property, but in horses, cattle, and sheep. They were, in essence, mobile societies, constantly moving their herds to fresh pastures, their entire existence intrinsically linked to the rhythm of the steppe. This constant movement fostered a remarkable resilience and adaptability, a culture where physical toughness and self-reliance were paramount. Imagine trying to explain the concept of a mortgage to someone whose entire home was designed to be packed up in an hour flat. They simply wouldn't understand the fuss. Their tents, or yurts, were practical and easily disassembled, their possessions few and portable. This nomadic existence, while seemingly simple, was actually a highly efficient and effective way of life for the vast open spaces of Central Asia. It also meant they were perpetually prepared for conflict, as raids for resources or territory were a common feature of steppe life. A brutal game of territorial chess played on horseback. Their diet consisted largely of meat and milk products, supplemented by whatever wild plants or grains they could gather or trade for. Stories of them eating raw meat, softened under their saddles, might be a bit of an exaggeration, but it certainly paints a vivid picture of their pragmatic approach to sustenance. They also developed an incredible proficiency with the bow and arrow, particularly the composite bow, a weapon far more powerful and accurate than the simple wooden bows used by many settled peoples. This bow, constructed from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, could launch arrows with incredible force, capable of piercing even heavy armor. When combined with their equestrian skills, it made them a truly terrifying force on the battlefield, capable of showering an enemy with arrows before vanishing over the horizon, only to reappear from an unexpected direction. They were, in essence, the special forces of their time, leaving their adversaries often wondering if they were fighting ghosts or mere mortals. As these nomadic groups, precursors to the Huns, faced increasing pressure from powerful Chinese dynasties to their east and rival steppe confederations, a slow, almost imperceptible shift began. Like water finding its lowest point, the vast human currents of the steppe began to flow westward. This wasn't a planned invasion, not yet, but rather a gradual displacement, a ripple effect across thousands of miles. As one group pushed another, the impact eventually reached the fringes of the Roman world, a world largely oblivious to the distant tremors that would soon rock its foundations. This westward movement was not a single unified march, but rather a series of migrations, probes, and expansions by various groups, each seeking new pastures, new opportunities, and new lands to call their own. They were, in a way, just looking for greener grass, utterly unaware they were about to stumble upon the greenest pastures of all, guarded by two rather large, somewhat complacent empires. And so, this vast, slow-motion westward drift continued, a gradual unspooling of nomadic energy across the vast plains of Central Asia. The people who would eventually be known as the Huns were not, at this stage, a monolithic entity with a singular, unified purpose. Instead, they were more like a sprawling, ever-shifting constellation of tribes, each with its own leaders and internal dynamics, but all sharing a common nomadic lifestyle, a deep connection to their horses, and a remarkable proficiency in mounted warfare. As they moved, they absorbed other smaller tribes, some willingly, others through conquest, like a rolling snowball gathering more snow. This process of assimilation and subjugation was a constant feature of steppe life, a brutal Darwinian struggle where only the strongest and most adaptable confederations survived and thrived. This wasn't a journey of discovery for them, mind you, in the sense of finding new spice routes or exotic lands for vacation. No, this was a journey of survival and expansion, driven by environmental pressures, internecine conflicts, and perhaps simply the allure of new, untapped resources. Imagine a group of ancient cowboys, constantly seeking better grazing lands for their herds, but with a rather aggressive approach to property disputes. Their trajectory, though perhaps not consciously planned in any grand strategic sense, brought them into contact with a bewildering array of peoples. Along the way, they encountered various Iranian-speaking groups, remnants of the ancient Scythians and Sarmatians, as well as early Turkic tribes and Finno-Ugric peoples who populated the vast reaches between the Altai Mountains and the Volga River. Each encounter, whether through trade, conflict, or absorption, subtly shaped the Hunnic identity, adding layers to their culture, language, and military tactics. It was a cultural melting pot, if that melting pot also happened to be a rather effective pressure cooker for forging formidable warriors. As the centuries rolled on, the Hunnic advance became more pronounced, and their presence began to register on the periphery of the more settled civilizations. By the 4th century CE, their eastward expansion had brought them to the region north of the Black Sea, an area then largely dominated by various Germanic tribes. This was a pivotal moment, a collision course set millennia in the making. For the Germanic peoples, particularly the Goths, who had established powerful kingdoms and federations in the lands between the Dnieper and Danube rivers, the arrival of the Huns was an unforeseen catastrophe. They had, for generations, been the primary external concern for the Roman Empire, a constant source of border skirmishes, raids, and occasional full-scale invasions. They were, in a sense, the neighborhood bullies of the Roman world, quite confident in their position, until a new, even tougher kid showed up on the block. The Goths themselves were a complex people, divided into several major branches, most notably the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths. The Visigoths occupied the western part of this region, closer to the Roman frontier, while the Ostrogoths held sway over the eastern territories. They were formidable warriors in their own right, accustomed to battle and well versed in the arts of raiding and defense. Their societies were structured around a warrior aristocracy, and they possessed a well-developed military organization, or so they thought, until they met a truly mobile fighting force. They had adopted aspects of Roman culture, some converting to Arian Christianity, and maintained a sometimes tense, sometimes cooperative relationship with the Roman Empire. They even had their own written language, thanks to the Gothic bishop Ulfilas, who translated the Bible into Gothic, which in hindsight was quite an intellectual feat for a people soon to be on the run. The first direct, violent encounters between the Huns and the Goths are generally placed around the 370s CE. The initial shock for the Goths must have been profound. They were accustomed to fighting infantry formations or cavalry that operated in a more traditional, heavy-handed manner. The Huns, however, were something entirely different. They fought from horseback with an agility and speed that was simply unprecedented. Their composite bows could unleash volleys of arrows with terrifying rapidity and accuracy, decimating enemy ranks before any hand-to-hand combat could even begin. And then, just as quickly, they would melt away, only to reappear from another angle, like a particularly annoying swarm of very deadly bees. Historians still argue whether the Goths initially mistook the Huns for some sort of supernatural apparition, given their appearance and fighting style. The story goes that the Huns first fell upon the Alans, an Iranian-speaking nomadic people living east of the Goths, crushing them with such ferocity that many Alans were either annihilated or subjugated and incorporated into the Hunnic Confederation. This was a common Hunnic tactic: defeat, then absorb. They weren't just about destruction, they were about growth, like a monstrous nomadic conglomerate. The Alans, with their own equestrian traditions, provided valuable additions to the Hunnic ranks, further bolstering their already formidable cavalry. This victory served as a chilling precursor of what was to come for the Goths, a clear signal that a new, terrifying power had arrived on the stage of European history. The Ostrogoths, under their king Ermanaric, a legendary figure said to be over 100 years old at the time, were the next to face the full force of the Hunnic onslaught. Ermanaric, a powerful ruler who had forged a vast, if loosely controlled kingdom, found himself utterly unprepared for this new kind of warfare. His heavily armed Gothic warriors, accustomed to close-quarters combat and pitched battles, were simply outmaneuvered and overwhelmed by the Huns' hit-and-run tactics, their relentless arrow fire, and their sheer speed. It was like trying to fight a swarm of mosquitoes with a broadsword, highly ineffective and rather frustrating. The traditional Gothic phalanxes and cavalry charges, which had served them so well against Roman legions and other Germanic tribes, were rendered largely ineffective against an enemy that refused to stand and fight in a conventional manner. The defeat of the Ostrogoths was catastrophic. Their kingdom shattered, Ermanaric reportedly died, either by his own hand or from wounds sustained in battle, a tragic end for a king who had once held such sway. The remnants of the Ostrogothic people were then forced to flee, scattered and desperate, many seeking refuge with their Visigothic kin. This created a domino effect, pushing the Visigoths closer to the Roman frontier, like a tightly packed queue suddenly being shoved from behind. The arrival of the Huns was not just a military defeat for the Goths, it was an existential crisis, a forced migration on an unprecedented scale that would forever alter the demographic and political landscape of Europe. It was the beginning of the Great Migration period, often called the Barbarian Invasions, though from the perspective of the Goths, it was more of a barbarian flight. The crushing defeat of the Ostrogoths by the Huns sent shockwaves throughout the Germanic world, reverberating all the way to the very edges of the Roman Empire. The tale of Ermanaric's demise and the shattering of his powerful kingdom spread like wildfire, a chilling testament to the Huns' terrifying effectiveness. It painted a picture of an unstoppable force, a whirlwind of horse and arrow that swept away everything in its path. For the Visigoths, who now found themselves directly in the path of this eastward moving tempest, the situation was dire. Their customary lands, which had provided them with sustenance and security for generations, were suddenly unsafe, threatened by an enemy unlike any they had ever encountered. It was as if their cozy little corner of the world had suddenly been declared an active war zone, and they were very much in the line of fire. Under the leadership of their chieftain, Fritigern, the Visigoths made a desperate decision. They would seek refuge within the very empire they had so often raided and fought against. They appealed to the Roman Emperor Valens, who ruled the Eastern Roman Empire from Constantinople, for permission to cross the Danube River and settle within Roman territory. This was not a small request. It represented a massive influx of people, tens of thousands of warriors, women, and children, along with their livestock and what few possessions they could carry. Imagine an entire nation showing up at your border, asking for asylum, and you'll get a sense of the scale of this migration. For Valens, it presented a complex dilemma. On one hand, allowing the Goths to settle could provide a much-needed buffer against the Huns and a source of potential recruits for the Roman army. On the other hand, it posed an immense logistical challenge and a potential internal security risk. Ultimately, Valens agreed, but with strict conditions. The Goths were to surrender their weapons, convert to Christianity, specifically Nicene Christianity, though many were Arian, a subtle theological point that would cause future friction, and their children would be taken as hostages. However, the execution of this plan was, to put it mildly, an absolute disaster. The Roman officials tasked with overseeing the crossing and settlement of the Goths proved to be spectacularly corrupt and incompetent. They extorted exorbitant prices for food, denied the Goths basic necessities, and generally treated them with utter contempt, proving that bureaucracy and greed are truly timeless human traits. The Goths, starving and humiliated, were driven to desperation. They refused to surrender their weapons entirely, managed to bribe many of the Roman border guards, and within a short time, the carefully managed influx turned into an uncontrolled torrent. This betrayal and mistreatment sparked a massive uprising among the Visigoths. They reclaimed their weapons, joined forces with other disaffected Gothic groups, and began to rampage through the Roman provinces of Thrace, looting, burning, and generally making life miserable for the local populace. Emperor Valens, underestimating the severity of the situation and perhaps overly confident in his legions, marched to confront them. The two forces met in 378 CE at the Battle of Adrianople, a catastrophic engagement for the Roman Empire. The Gothic cavalry, now well-fed and furious, shattered the Roman legions, and Emperor Valens himself was killed, a truly rare and shocking event in Roman history. It was a defeat of epic proportions, a stark demonstration of the vulnerability of the Roman military machine, and a clear signal that the world was changing. The Battle of Adrianople wasn't just a loss, it was a wake-up call, a shattering of the illusion of Roman invincibility. The Visigothic victory at Adrianople further highlighted the immense power vacuum created by the Hunnic pressure. While the Goths were the direct perpetrators of the Roman defeat, the Huns were the unseen hand that had set the entire chain of events in motion. They had pushed the Goths, who in turn pushed the Romans, creating a domino effect that would eventually lead to the unraveling of the Western Roman Empire. The Huns themselves, meanwhile, continued their westward expansion like an ever-widening ripple in a pond. They encountered various other nomadic groups, such as the Gepids, Rugians, and Seres, either conquering them outright or compelling them to join the Hunnic Confederation. This constant absorption of new tribes provided the Huns with a steady supply of fresh warriors, further swelling their ranks and diversifying their military capabilities. It was a rather brutal recruitment strategy, but undeniably effective. As the Huns advanced, their reputation preceded them, carried on the winds of fear and rumor. Tales of their ferocity, their strange appearance, and their seemingly invincible mounted archers spread across the European continent. To the settled peoples of Europe, accustomed to agricultural life and fixed settlements, the nomadic lifestyle of the Huns seemed utterly alien and terrifying. They moved with a speed that defied comprehension, appearing suddenly and vanishing just as quickly, leaving behind only devastation. It was like trying to catch smoke, always there, but never quite graspable. This psychological impact was almost as powerful as their military might. The mere whisper of the Huns' approach was often enough to send entire populations into a panic, abandoning their homes and fleeing for the perceived safety of walled cities. The arrival of the Huns effectively destabilized the entire existing order of barbarian Europe. For centuries, the Germanic tribes had been the primary players on the periphery of the Roman Empire, alternately raiding and serving as federati, or allied troops, within its borders. Now, a new, more powerful force had emerged, capable of displacing even the strongest of these Germanic groups. This forced many of the Germanic tribes to make difficult choices: fight and be annihilated, submit and become part of the Hunnic machine, or flee westward into the Roman Empire, hoping to find refuge there. Many chose the latter, creating a massive demographic shift that historians refer to as the migration period. Think of it as a giant historical game of musical chairs, except the music was the thundering hooves of Hunnic cavalry, and the losers didn't get a chair. They got to run for their lives. This large-scale migration, spurred by Hunnic pressure, had profound and lasting consequences for the Roman Empire. The influx of so many desperate and often hostile peoples strained Roman resources, overwhelmed their administrative capacity, and led to a breakdown of order in many provinces. The Roman legions, already stretched thin defending vast frontiers, found themselves fighting on multiple fronts, both externally against the Huns and internally against the very peoples they had allowed to settle. It was a strategic nightmare, like trying to plug multiple leaks in a rapidly sinking ship. The economic impact was also severe, as fertile lands were laid waste, trade routes disrupted, and cities sacked. Furthermore, the Huns themselves were not content to simply push others into the Roman Empire. They also began to conduct their own raids directly into Roman territory, initially in the Balkans, then pushing further west. These raids were typically not aimed at permanent conquest, but rather at plunder and the extraction of tribute. They would descend upon a region, loot what they could, capture slaves, and then retreat back to their steppe strongholds, carrying their ill-gotten gains. This hit-and-run strategy, combined with their incredible mobility, made them incredibly difficult for the Roman armies to counter effectively. It was a classic guerrilla warfare scenario, played out on a grand scale across entire continents. The Romans, with their fixed fortifications and slower-moving legions, found themselves constantly reacting rather than proactively engaging, a position no empire ever wants to be in. The Roman emperors, both east and west, found themselves in an unenviable position. They were dealing with an internal crisis brought on by the Gothic migrations and an external threat from the Huns that seemed to grow more formidable with each passing year. The traditional Roman policy of divide and conquer, or playing one barbarian tribe against another, was becoming increasingly difficult to implement effectively against the unified, albeit loosely, Hunnic Confederacy. The scale of the Hunnic threat was unprecedented, forcing the Romans to reevaluate their entire defensive strategy and their relationship with the various barbarian groups on their borders. It was a grim new reality, a world where the old rules no longer seemed to apply. The relentless, terrifying pressure exerted by the Huns on the Germanic tribes created a monumental shift in the geopolitical landscape of Europe, a domino effect that would eventually reverberate through the very heart of the Roman Empire. The subjugation and dispersal of the Ostrogoths and the subsequent desperate flight of the Visigoths across the Danube were merely the opening acts of a much larger, more tragic drama for the classical world. It was as if someone had kicked over a giant ant colony, and all the ants, in their frantic search for a new home, were headed directly for the meticulously manicured Roman lawn. The settled peoples of the empire, who had grown accustomed to a certain level of predictable chaos on their borders, were now faced with an entirely new, unscripted level of existential threat. The initial impact, as we remember, saw the Goths seeking refuge within the Roman Empire, a decision born of sheer desperation, rather than any newfound affection for toga parties. Their subsequent mistreatment by corrupt Roman officials, culminating in the catastrophic Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE, exposed the fragility of Roman power and the deep internal fissures within the empire. But while the Goths were fighting their own battles against their Roman hosts, the Huns continued their inexorable advance westward, expanding their sphere of influence and solidifying their position as the dominant power north of the Danube. They weren't just a raiding party, they were a burgeoning empire in their own right, built on the fearsome efficiency of their nomadic warfare and a knack for making enemies join their team. The sheer scale of the Gothic subjugation by the Huns was immense. The Ostrogoths, once a powerful and unified kingdom under figures like Ermanaric, were shattered. Many were killed in battle, others fled, and a significant portion were incorporated directly into the Hunnic Confederation. This wasn't a gentle absorption, it was a forced conscription, with Gothic warriors compelled to fight alongside their new Hunnic masters. Imagine being forced to join the very people who just destroyed your home and killed your king, then being expected to cheerfully fight their next battle. It's a rather extreme form of team-building exercise, to say the least. These Gothic contingents, now part of the Hunnic war machine, added their own heavy cavalry and infantry traditions to the Huns' already formidable mounted archers, making the Hunnic forces even more versatile and terrifying. The Visigoths, as we've seen, found their uneasy sanctuary within the Roman Empire, but their story of dispersal didn't end there. After Adrianople, they continued to wander, ravaging the Balkans, and eventually moving into Italy, famously sacking Rome itself in 410 CE under Alaric. This event, shocking to the civilized world, was a direct consequence of the Hunnic pressure that had initially driven them from their homes. From Italy, they eventually moved into Gaul and then Spain, establishing new kingdoms and forever changing the face of the Western Roman Empire. Their flight, then, was not just a temporary inconvenience, but a fundamental reordering of European demographics, a grand reshuffling of entire peoples across the continent. It's almost as if the Huns, without directly marching on Rome in force at this early stage, had managed to conquer it by proxy through the very people they displaced. Meanwhile, the Huns themselves were establishing a vast, albeit loosely defined dominion over a multitude of diverse peoples. They controlled a vast swathe of territory stretching from the Pannonian Basin, modern-day Hungary, in the west, eastward across the Pontic steppe, and encompassing various Germanic, Slavic, Alanic, and other nomadic tribes. This vast confederation was not a centralized empire in the Roman sense, with elaborate bureaucracies and fixed institutions. Instead, it was a mobile, militarized dominion held together by the charismatic leadership of its chieftains, the shared experience of conquest, and the brutal efficiency of Hunnic military might. It was less like a nation-state and more like a very, very large and aggressive gang. The Huns demanded tribute from their subject peoples, both in the form of gold and silver and in warriors. This system allowed them to maintain a standing army of immense proportions, constantly replenished by the manpower of the subjugated tribes. It was a self-sustaining engine of conquest. They conquered tribes, extracted resources, and used those resources and new recruits to conquer more tribes. This was a remarkably effective model for a nomadic power, avoiding the logistical headaches of administering vast territories directly, and instead simply demanding protection money from everyone within their reach. The impact of this Hunnic dispersal of the Goths and other tribes cannot be overstated in the narrative of the late Roman Empire. It fundamentally altered the balance of power on the Roman frontiers. For centuries, the Roman strategy had been to contain barbarian threats, to absorb some as settlers and soldiers, and to play rival tribes against each other. But the Huns broke this paradigm. They were too numerous, too mobile, and too destructive to be contained by conventional Roman methods. Their arrival forced a permanent shift in Roman foreign policy from proactive defense to desperate reaction. The emperors in both East and West found themselves constantly negotiating, bribing, and sometimes fighting against forces that had been unleashed directly or indirectly by the Hunnic presence. The economic consequences for the Roman Empire were also severe. Regions that had once been productive agricultural areas or vital trade routes were now depopulated or devastated by war and migration. The movement of so many people disrupted established economic systems, leading to food shortages, inflation, and a general decline in prosperity. Cities became isolated, and the vital flow of goods and resources became increasingly precarious. Imagine trying to run a vast supply chain when half your suppliers are suddenly on the run and the other half are paying protection money to a nomadic overlord. It simply wasn't conducive to a booming economy. Furthermore, the psychological impact on the Roman populace was immense. The Huns became a symbol of apocalyptic dread, the scourge of God, as they would later be called. Their sudden appearance, their devastating raids, and their seemingly invulnerable fighting style instilled a deep sense of fear and helplessness. People genuinely believed that the end of days was nigh, brought about by these terrifying horsemen from the east. This pervasive fear contributed to a sense of fatalism and decline within the empire, eroding morale and civic engagement. It's difficult to maintain a bustling society when everyone is constantly looking over their shoulder, expecting the arrival of nomadic horse archers. The Roman response, particularly in the Eastern Empire, often involved a policy of appeasement and tribute. Rather than engaging in costly and often futile military campaigns against the elusive Huns, the emperors found it more expedient, albeit humiliating, to pay them off. This tribute, sometimes in gold, sometimes in goods, served as a kind of protection money, buying temporary peace and diverting Hunnic attention towards other, less affluent targets. This reliance on tribute, however, only strengthened the Huns' economic power and incentivized further demands, creating a vicious cycle that drained the Roman treasury. It was a very expensive form of go away, please, that seemed to only encourage them to come back more often. Historians still argue whether the Hunnic Empire, as it existed, was truly an empire in the classical sense, or merely a vast temporary tribal confederation. The nature of their governance, the fluidity of their allegiances, and their lack of permanent administrative structures suggest a less centralized entity than Rome or Persia. Yet their ability to command vast armies drawn from diverse peoples and to exert control over immense territories undeniably gave them the characteristics of a major power. It was an empire forged not with stone and law, but with iron and terror, held together by the force of personality of its leaders and the shared experience of plunder. This distinction is important because it highlights the unique challenge they posed to the settled empires. They were a force of nature as much as a political entity, difficult to understand and even harder to defeat. Their very existence was a constant, unsettling reminder of the precariousness of civilization when faced with a truly dynamic and unyielding nomadic power. The profound ripple effect of the Huns' westward push, particularly the mass displacement of the Goths, directly translated into an unprecedented pressure on the Roman Empire's frontiers. Suddenly, the borders of both the Western and Eastern Roman empires, particularly the vast stretch of the Danube River, were not just lines on a map, but zones of intense instability. It was as if a perfectly calm lake had suddenly developed a massive tidal wave, threatening to engulf everything in its path. For centuries, the Roman legions had been the seemingly insurmountable barrier, the iron fist that kept the barbarian world at bay. But now, that barrier was cracking under the sheer weight of desperate humanity and the terrifying force that drove them. The Roman Empire, by the late 4th century, was already a vast and complex entity, divided into Western and Eastern halves, each with its own emperor, administration, and military challenges. The Western Empire, with its capital eventually shifting from Rome to Ravenna, was facing a declining population, economic woes, and internal political instability. The Eastern Empire, centered on the magnificent city of Constantinople, was generally wealthier and more stable, but equally wary of external threats. Both halves, however, found themselves grappling with a problem of immense scale: how to manage the relentless waves of Germanic peoples, now refugees from the Huns, who were clamoring at their gates, not just for plunder, but for survival. This wasn't just a matter of defending against traditional raids, where a disciplined legion might chase off a few thousand warriors. No, this was a migration of entire peoples, tens of thousands strong, often accompanied by their families, livestock, and whatever meager possessions they could carry. They were not just an army, they were a moving nation, desperate for land and safety. The Roman authorities, initially attempting to control and settle these large groups, quickly found their administrative and logistical capacities overwhelmed. The very system designed to manage border incursions was cracking under the strain of what amounted to a demographic avalanche. It was like trying to manage rush hour traffic with a single, overwhelmed traffic cop and a broken set of lights. The Danube frontier, in particular, became a hotbed of activity. This mighty river had long served as a natural barrier, heavily fortified with Roman watchtowers and garrisons. But the sheer volume of people seeking to cross, coupled with the Huns pushing from behind, made the traditional defenses increasingly ineffective. The Romans found themselves in a constant state of alert, deploying legions and auxiliary units to reinforce vulnerable points, often shifting troops from other critical areas. This created a strategic dilemma: defend one section and risk leaving another exposed, a constant game of military whack-a-mole that drained resources and stretched manpower to its breaking point. Adding to the complexity was the Hunnic strategy itself. While they sometimes conducted direct raids into Roman territory, their most insidious pressure came from their indirect influence. By pushing other tribes, the Huns effectively turned them into human battering rams against the Roman borders. The Romans were therefore forced to fight on two fronts: against the Huns themselves and against the barbarian groups who were fleeing the Huns. It was a rather brilliant, if terrifying strategy on the part of the Huns, turning their enemies' enemies into their own unintentional allies, or at least useful instruments. The need to defend against these new threats led to significant changes in Roman military policy. The empire increasingly relied on foederati, or allied barbarian troops, often settling them within Roman territory in exchange for military service. This was a double-edged sword. While it provided much-needed manpower, it also meant that Roman armies were increasingly composed of non-Roman elements, sometimes with questionable loyalty, as the Goths at Adrianople had so vividly demonstrated. It was a bit like hiring your former rivals to guard your house. Sometimes it worked, sometimes they just let themselves in for a permanent stay. Beyond military responses, the Roman emperors resorted to diplomacy, often accompanied by hefty tribute payments. It became a recurring pattern. The Huns would raid, demonstrate their power, and then demand a payment to withdraw. This was a humiliating but often pragmatic choice for the Romans. Large-scale military campaigns against the elusive Hunnic cavalry were incredibly costly, difficult to win decisively, and carried the risk of catastrophic defeat, as Adrianople had shown. Paying tribute, while a drain on the treasury, often bought temporary peace and allowed the Romans to focus on other pressing internal or external issues. This practice, however, effectively turned the Roman Empire into a giant ATM for the Huns, dispensing gold at regular intervals. The Romans also attempted to play the diplomatic game, sending envoys to the Hunnic court, trying to ascertain their intentions, and sometimes even fostering rivalries between different Hunnic factions. These diplomatic missions were often fraught with peril and cultural misunderstandings. Roman ambassadors, accustomed to the grandeur of imperial courts, found themselves in nomadic camps, dealing with leaders who valued strength and immediate advantage over legal niceties or long-term treaties. It was like trying to negotiate a corporate merger with a highly organized biker gang. The rules of engagement were entirely different. The presence of the Huns also had a profound impact on the psychology of the Roman population. The constant threat, the devastating raids, and the sheer unpredictability of the Hunnic movements fostered a deep sense of insecurity. People lived in fear, and the once unshakable belief in Roman invincibility began to erode. This psychological toll contributed to the general decline of morale and civic engagement in many areas, as citizens questioned the ability of their government to protect them. It's difficult to plan for the future when you're constantly worried about nomadic horsemen appearing on your horizon. Despite the immense pressure, the Roman Empire, particularly the East, showed remarkable resilience. They managed to survive the initial onslaught, largely due to their superior resources, better organized administration, and the strategic advantages offered by Constantinople's formidable defenses. The Eastern Roman Empire, sometimes referred to as the Byzantine Empire, would continue to exist for another 1,000 years, long after the western half had crumbled. But even for the East, the Huns represented a constant nagging threat, diverting resources and attention from other imperial ambitions. Historians still debate the extent to which the Huns were directly responsible for the fall of the Western Roman Empire. While they didn't deliver the final blow, their role as a catalyst for the mass migrations and the sustained pressure they exerted undoubtedly weakened the empire considerably, making it more vulnerable to other internal and external pressures. It was as if the Huns had systematically removed all the supporting beams from a grand ancient building, leaving it susceptible to the slightest gust of wind. The relentless pressure on the frontiers was not just a military problem. It was an economic, social, and psychological crisis that slowly but surely chipped away at the foundations of Roman power. The once clear lines of Roman control blurred into a chaotic patchwork of contested territories, a testament to the Huns' ability to disrupt and dominate without ever formally occupying vast stretches of land. With the Roman Empire reeling from the initial waves of migration and the shocking defeat at Adrianople, the stage was set for a new era of uneasy coexistence and strategic appeasement with the terrifying power to their north, the Huns. It was during this precarious period that the astute Eastern Roman Emperor Theodosius III, often called the Great, rose to prominence. His reign from 379 to 395 CE was marked by a complex and often contradictory policy towards the barbarian tribes, a blend of military might, shrewd diplomacy, and, perhaps most notably, a willingness to open the imperial purse strings. He was, in a way, the master of the very expensive, keep them happy, or at least distracted approach to foreign policy. Theodosius inherited an empire in crisis. The disaster at Adrianople had left the Roman army severely depleted, and the Goths were still rampaging through the Balkans. A rather unwelcome houseguest who had overstayed their welcome and trashed the furniture. His immediate challenge was to stabilize the situation and prevent further disintegration, rather than attempting to annihilate the Goths, a feat that seemed increasingly impossible given their numbers and recent victories. Theodosius opted for a policy of integration. He negotiated a treaty with the Visigoths in 382 CE, settling them within Roman territory as foederati, essentially allowing them to live under their own laws and leaders in exchange for military service to Rome. This was a pragmatic but controversial move, effectively establishing a state within a state and signaling a new reality for the empire. But while Theodosius was dealing with the Gothic problem, the Hunnic threat loomed ever larger, a dark cloud on the northern horizon. The Huns, having effectively pushed the Goths into Roman lands, were now establishing their own vast sphere of influence north of the Danube. They were not yet a unified, singular entity under one supreme leader, but rather a collection of powerful tribal groups, each led by its own chieftain, all capable of launching devastating raids. It was a bit like trying to negotiate with a particularly boisterous and well-armed committee, where each member had their own agenda, but all agreed on the profitability of Roman gold. Theodosius's approach to the Huns was primarily one of diplomacy and strategic payments. Recognizing the immense difficulty and cost of engaging the Huns in large-scale military campaigns on their home turf, he understood that a policy of outright confrontation was likely to be disastrous. Instead, he sought to buy peace, or at least divert their attention through regular subsidies. These payments, often in gold, sometimes in exotic goods, were presented not as tribute, but as generous gifts or payments for allied services, a rather polite fiction for what was essentially protection money. This system, while financially draining, allowed the Roman Empire to avoid open warfare with the Huns for significant periods, giving them breathing room to deal with other internal and external pressures. One of the key aspects of Theodosius's diplomatic strategy was the careful cultivation of relationships with various Hunnic chieftains. He would send lavish embassies to their nomadic camps, bearing gifts and engaging in complex negotiations. These envoys, often seasoned diplomats like Olympiodorus or Priscus, though Priscus would come later, had to navigate the often unpredictable world of the Hunnic leaders, where hospitality could quickly turn into a demand for more tribute. They learned to respect the Huns' martial prowess and their disinterest in Roman formalities, often finding themselves in stark, rustic settings rather than the opulent courts they were accustomed to. Imagine a meticulously dressed Roman diplomat trying to explain nuanced legal points to a chieftain whose idea of diplomacy involved a large horse and a very sharp sword. Cultural differences were certainly an understatement. The Huns, for their part, were not entirely averse to these arrangements. While they were formidable warriors, they also understood the practical benefits of Roman gold and goods. It allowed them to acquire luxury items, bolster their prestige among their own people, and reduce the need for constant raiding, at least for a time. So a strange, symbiotic relationship emerged. The Romans paid for peace, and the Huns agreed temporarily to leave them alone. This wasn't a peace born of mutual respect, but rather one born of mutual, if cynical, convenience. Theodosius also employed a tactic of recruiting Hunnic mercenaries into the Roman army. This was another risky but pragmatic move. By enlisting Hunnic warriors, often as cavalry, the Romans hoped to turn their formidable fighting skills against their own kinsmen or other barbarian enemies. Those Hunnic auxiliaries, while effective, were also notoriously unreliable, prone to switching allegiances if a better offer came along or if they felt slighted. It was a bit like inviting a tiger into your house to scare away the neighborhood cats. It might work, but you always had to keep an eye on the tiger. This practice was a clear indication of the desperate measures the Roman Empire was resorting to in order to shore up its military. Historians still argue whether Theodosius's policies of appeasement ultimately strengthened or weakened the empire in the long run. While they undeniably bought time and prevented immediate catastrophe, they also established a precedent of paying off barbarian powers, a practice that would become increasingly common and increasingly unsustainable for future emperors. It was a short-term solution to a long-term problem, like constantly patching a leaky roof instead of replacing it entirely. Each payment, while averting immediate crisis, subtly eroded the imperial prestige and drained vital resources. Despite the heavy financial burden, Theodosius's reign saw a period of relative stability for the Eastern Empire, especially compared to the turbulent West. He managed to keep the Hunnic hordes mostly at bay, allowing the Eastern Empire to recover somewhat from the Adrianople disaster and consolidate its position. He even briefly reunified the entire Roman Empire under his rule after defeating Western usurpers, though this reunification was fleeting. His death in 395 CE marked the final permanent division of the Roman Empire into East and West. leaving his sons to grapple with the increasingly complex and dangerous world he left behind. The Huns, of course, were not static during this period. While some were engaged in mercenary service or accepting Roman tributes, others continued to probe the frontiers, test Roman defenses, and expand their own power base north of the Danube. They were constantly consolidating their own internal structures, slowly moving towards the more centralized leadership that would characterize their later, more unified, and far more terrifying phase. The various Hunnic chieftains, initially operating somewhat independently, were gradually brought under the sway of more powerful and ambitious figures. The diplomatic efforts of Theodosius, while successful in their immediate goal, were essentially delaying the inevitable, like carefully applying band-aids to a wound that required major surgery. The true storm, the one that would sweep across Europe and shake the very foundations of Rome, was still brewing, quietly gathering its terrifying force in the vast, open lands north of the great river. Even as Emperor Theodosius pursued his delicate dance of diplomacy and payments, a new and increasingly powerful force was quietly coalescing within the Hunnic Confederation. The various independent Hunnic chieftains, who had previously operated with relative autonomy, were gradually being brought under a more unified, albeit still fluid, command. This slow but steady consolidation of power marked a crucial step in the Huns' evolution from a collection of formidable raiding parties to a truly singular and terrifying force on the European stage. And at the heart of this evolving power structure stood a figure who, though perhaps less famous than his eventual successor, laid much of the groundwork for the Hunnic Empire's future dominance. Rua, also known as Rugila or Roas in various Roman sources, emerged as one of the most significant Hunnic leaders in the early 5th century. While details of his early life are scarce, as is common for many nomadic leaders not directly involved in Roman affairs, his impact is undeniable. He was not just a warrior. He was a shrewd political operator, demonstrating a remarkable ability to unite disparate Hunnic and subjugated tribes under his banner. Imagine trying to herd cats if those cats were heavily armed, fiercely independent tribal leaders with a penchant for raiding. Rua, it seems, possessed that particular skill set. He understood that a fragmented force, no matter how individually strong, could not exert the sustained pressure or extract the immense wealth that a unified one could. Under Rua's leadership, the Hunnic Confederation began to act with a greater degree of cohesion and strategic purpose. Their raids into Roman territory, which had previously been somewhat sporadic and opportunistic, became more frequent, more organized, and demonstrably more demanding. These were no longer just hit-and-run plundering expeditions. They were often deliberate demonstrations of power, designed to extract maximum concessions from the beleaguered Roman emperors. The Huns under Rua became masters of the art of intimidation, using their fearsome reputation as leverage in their negotiations. They knew that the mere whisper of their approach was often enough to send Roman officials scurrying to gather tribute. The primary target of Rua's early campaigns was the Eastern Roman Empire, particularly its rich Balkan provinces. The lands south of the Danube, including Thrace, Emosia, and Illyricum, were fertile and relatively wealthy, offering tempting targets for Hunnic plunder. Roman cities like Martianople and Serdica, once thriving centers of trade and administration, frequently found themselves under threat, their citizens living in constant fear of the thundering hooves and whistling arrows. Rua's forces would sweep down, often bypassing heavily fortified positions, to strike at undefended towns and villages, seizing captives and vast amounts of loot. It was like a very efficient, very violent protection racket, with the Huns as the enforcers. The Roman response, largely following Theodosius I's established precedent, was often to buy them off. Emperor Theodosius II, who succeeded his father, found himself constantly negotiating with Rua. The annual tribute payments to the Huns soared during Rua's time, reaching astronomical sums. These payments were a painful drain on the imperial treasury, diverting funds that could have been used for infrastructure, military development, or other pressing needs. But the alternative, a full-scale invasion by the Huns, was simply too terrifying to contemplate. The Romans, quite literally, paid for peace, even if that peace was always precarious and temporary, like a calm before an even bigger storm. One of the more interesting aspects of Rua's reign was his involvement, or rather the Hunnic involvement, in Roman politics. The Huns, surprisingly for a nomadic people, developed a sophisticated understanding of the internal dynamics of the Roman Empire and occasionally intervened, either directly or indirectly, in imperial succession disputes or power struggles. They understood that a weak or divided Rome was easier to exploit, and a grateful Roman faction might offer more lucrative payments. It was a rather cynical but effective foreign policy for a people supposedly lacking in civilized political machinations. A notable example of this was Rua's demand in 433 CE for the return of several Hunnic fugitives who had sought asylum within the Roman Empire. This might seem like a minor diplomatic spat, but Rua framed it as a matter of honor and a test of Roman sincerity. He threatened widespread devastation if the fugitives were not handed over, demonstrating the extent of his leverage over Constantinople. Theodosius II, fearing the consequences of refusal, reluctantly agreed, even allowing the Hunnic envoys to execute the fugitives on Roman soil. This humiliating episode underscored the subservient position the Eastern Roman Empire found itself in when dealing with Rua, illustrating just how much power the Huns wielded. Rua also maintained a complex relationship with the Western Roman Empire, which at this point was largely under the de facto control of its powerful general Aetius. Aetius himself had a fascinating history with the Huns. He had spent time among them as a hostage in his youth, learning their language and their ways. This unique experience gave him an unparalleled understanding of Hunnic culture and military tactics, making him one of the few Romans who truly comprehended the nature of the threat. For a period, Aetius even employed Hunnic mercenaries to bolster his own position and campaign against rivals within the Western Empire, a dangerous game of playing with fire, if you will. This often meant the Western Romans were, in essence, paying the Huns to fight for them, while the Eastern Romans were paying them to not fight against them. It sounds complicated because it absolutely was. The rise of Rua solidified the Hunnic Confederation into a more formidable and cohesive unit. He paved the way for the even greater expansion and devastation that would come under his nephew. His military successes and diplomatic demands ensured that the Huns were no longer just a peripheral nuisance, but a central player in the grand, chaotic drama of the late Roman world. He established the Hunnic presence in the Pannonian Basin, modern Hungary, which would become the heartland of the Hunnic Empire, providing a stable base for their future campaigns. This strategic location, with its vast plains and proximity to both Roman empires, was an ideal launchpad for their operations. Historians still argue whether Rua envisioned the vast empire that Attila would later forge, or if his ambitions were more limited to consolidating power and extracting tribute. What is clear, however, is that he provided the crucial foundation. He took a collection of formidable but disparate tribes and began the process of welding them into a unified force. He refined the methods of extortion and intimidation that would become hallmarks of Hunnic foreign policy. He proved that the Roman Empire, despite its vastness, was vulnerable to a persistent and strategically astute nomadic power. His reign marked the point where the Huns transitioned from a regional threat to a continental force, ready to cast an even longer, more terrifying shadow over the crumbling foundations of the Roman world. The stage was being meticulously set, not by grand architects of stone, but by the relentless hooves of steppe ponies and the formidable will of a new kind of leader. As the sun began to set on the reign of Rua, the powerful Hunnic chieftain who had so effectively consolidated Hunnic power and brought the Eastern Roman Empire to heel with escalating tribute demands, a new figure was emerging from the shadows, poised to eclipse all who came before him. This was a young man whose name would echo through history as the embodiment of destruction and fear, a name that still, even today, conjures images of unbridled ferocity: Attila. His early life, like that of many nomadic leaders, is not extensively documented in contemporary Roman sources, which tended to focus more on his devastating impact than on his formative years. It's almost as if the scribes of Rome only started paying attention when he showed up at their doorstep with a very large army and a rather pointed request for all their valuables. Attila was born into the ruling lineage of the Huns, likely in the early 5th century, a nephew of Rua. This familial connection immediately placed him within the inner circle of Hunnic leadership, granting him access to power and influence that others could only dream of. He wasn't some common warrior who fought his way up from obscurity. He was born into the Hunnic equivalent of royalty, meaning he likely had a good horse and a sharp bow from a very young age. This privileged upbringing, however, did not diminish his drive or his martial prowess. On the contrary, it seems to have honed them, providing him with the training and opportunities necessary to cultivate the skills required for supreme leadership in a nomadic warrior society. From a young age, Attila would have been immersed in the quintessential Hunnic way of life, a world dominated by horses, hunting, and warfare. He would have spent countless hours in the saddle, learning the intricate art of horsemanship that made the Huns so formidable. Imagine spending your entire childhood on horseback, learning to shoot a bow with deadly accuracy while galloping at full speed. It puts modern-day sporting achievements into a rather humbling perspective. This mastery of the horse was not merely a military skill, it was a fundamental aspect of Hunnic culture, interwoven with their identity, economy, and social structure. Their horses were their transportation, their wealth, and their most vital tool of war. He would have learned to wield the composite bow, the Huns' signature weapon, with lethal precision. This weapon, powerful and difficult to master, required immense strength and constant practice. Attila, by all accounts, was an expert archer, a skill that commanded immense respect among his warriors. He would also have participated in the frequent raiding expeditions and tribal skirmishes that were a constant feature of steppe life, gaining invaluable experience in strategy, logistics, and the brutal realities of combat. These early experiences were his classroom, shaping him into the formidable military commander he would become. He learned firsthand the effectiveness of lightning-fast attacks, the psychological impact of terror, and the importance of overwhelming force. Attila's early ascent within the Hunnic hierarchy wasn't solely based on his lineage or military skill. He also possessed a sharp intellect and a keen understanding of politics, both within the Hunnic Confederation and in his dealings with the Roman Empire. Roman sources, though often biased, depict him as intelligent, cunning, and exceptionally ambitious. He wasn't just a brute, he was a strategic thinker, capable of planning large-scale campaigns and complex diplomatic maneuvers. He could be charming and persuasive when it suited his purpose, but also ruthless and uncompromising when necessary. It's safe to say he wasn't someone you wanted to cross at a negotiation table, or, for that matter, on a battlefield. One of the significant early events that likely shaped Attila's perspective was his time, or the time of other high-ranking Huns, as a diplomatic hostage in the Roman Empire. While sources aren't entirely clear if Attila himself was a hostage, it was a common practice for Roman and Hunnic leaders to exchange noble youths as pledges of peace or as a part of diplomatic agreements. Aetius, the powerful Roman general, famously spent time as a hostage among the Huns and likely formed connections that would prove vital later. Conversely, Hunnic nobles would have been sent to Roman courts. If Attila did spend time in Rome or Constantinople, even as a privileged guest, it would have given him invaluable insight into the Roman world, their strengths, their weaknesses, their opulent wealth, and their internal divisions. He would have seen their cities, their armies, and perhaps most importantly, their vulnerabilities. It would have been a masterclass in understanding the enemy from the inside, like a very well-funded spy mission. Upon the death of his uncle Rua, around 434 CE, Attila inherited leadership of the Hunnic Empire, alongside his elder brother, Bleda. The joint rule was a common, though often unstable arrangement in nomadic societies, a sort of co-CEO model where one might eventually decide they preferred a solo venture. For a time, they ruled together, cementing the Hunnic grip on the vast territories north of the Danube and continuing the policy of extracting tribute from the Eastern Roman Empire. Their initial acts involved renewing the treaty with Theodosius II, demanding an increase in the annual tribute from 350 pounds of gold to a staggering 700 pounds, and insisting on severe penalties for any Hunnic deserters or fugitives. This was a clear signal that the new leadership was even more assertive than the old. However, the joint rule of Attila and Bleda was destined to be short-lived. The Hunnic system, while adaptable, often favored singular, powerful leadership, especially for grand campaigns. Attila's ambition and undeniable charisma likely made him impatient with sharing power. Historians still argue whether Bleda was genuinely a rival or simply became a victim of Attila's ruthless drive for absolute control. The prevailing account suggests that around 445 CE, Attila orchestrated Bleda's death, either personally killing him during a hunting trip or having him assassinated. It was a brutal but effective move, clearing the path for Attila's undisputed supremacy. This act of fratricide, whether literally true or a symbolic narrative, underscored Attila's willingness to do whatever was necessary to achieve his goals. He was clearly not one to shy away from uncomfortable family dinners, especially if he was bringing the main course. With Bleda removed, Attila stood as the sole, undisputed ruler of the vast Hunnic Empire. This moment marked a critical turning point. No longer would Hunnic power be distributed or diluted. It would flow directly from the singular will of Attila. He was now free to pursue his grand ambitions, to lead the Hunnic Confederation, not just in raids for tribute, but in campaigns of conquest and devastation on an unprecedented scale. His early life, a blend of traditional Hunnic martial training, shrewd political observation, and a ruthlessness that would define his reign, had prepared him perfectly for this moment. He was the coiled spring, now fully released, ready to unleash the full, terrifying might of the Huns upon a world that was still struggling to comprehend the true nature of the nomadic storm that had settled on its doorstep. The gentle, sleepy cadence might make it seem serene, but the history unfolding here was anything but for the people living through it. With the removal of Bleda, whether by his own hand or through cunning machinations, Attila now stood as the undisputed singular leader of the vast and fearsome Hunnic Confederation. This moment, around 445 CE, marked a pivotal turning point in the history of the Huns, and indeed in the trajectory of the late Roman Empire. Attila was no longer merely a powerful chieftain. He was the Kagan, the supreme ruler whose will commanded the obedience of not just the Hunnic core, but also the myriad of subjugated Germanic, Alanic, and Slavic tribes that now formed the diverse tapestry of his burgeoning empire. Imagine trying to get all your relatives to agree on a holiday destination and then multiply that challenge by 1,000, add weapons, and you'll get a faint idea of the organizational feat Attila pulled off. The consolidation of power under Attila was a testament not only to his ruthless ambition, but also to his exceptional charisma and strategic brilliance. He possessed an innate understanding of how to maintain control over such a diverse and restless collection of peoples. His leadership was absolute, brooking no dissent, but it was also pragmatic. He understood that while fear was a powerful motivator, consistent success in battle and the promise of rich plunder were even more effective in binding his disparate forces together. He was, in essence, the ultimate incentive package for a warrior society. The first order of business for Attila was to ensure that all the tribes within his sphere of influence recognized his sole authority. This involved a combination of military might and cunning diplomacy. Any Hunnic chieftain or allied tribal leader who dared to question his supremacy quickly found themselves facing the full, brutal force of his loyal warriors. Rebellions were swiftly and decisively crushed, serving as chilling examples to others who might harbor similar rebellious thoughts. He purged any lingering elements of dissent, ensuring that the Hunnic war machine was perfectly aligned with his singular vision. It was a rather swift and permanent method of achieving corporate synergy. Under Attila, the Hunnic Empire reached its absolute zenith. Its territorial reach extended from the Volga River in the east to the Rhine River in the west, encompassing vast swathes of what is now modern-day Ukraine, Hungary, Romania, Slovakia, and parts of Germany. To the north, their influence stretched into the Baltic Sea region, and to the south, they exerted immense pressure on the Roman frontiers along the Danube. This was not an empire in the Roman sense, with a centralized bureaucracy, codified laws, or vast fixed infrastructure. Instead, it was a highly mobile military-based confederation held together by the overwhelming force of Attila's personality and the shared pursuit of conquest and tribute. Think of it as a vast, highly efficient, and utterly terrifying nomadic superstate. The administrative center of this sprawling mobile empire was located in the Pannonian Basin, in what is now Hungary. Here, Attila established his royal court, a large, fortified encampment made up of traditional Hunnic yurts, tents, and wooden structures rather than stone buildings. It served as his base of operations, where he received envoys, planned campaigns, and distributed plunder. The Roman historian Priscus, who famously visited Attila's court, described it as surprisingly orderly and functional, albeit rustic by Roman standards. He recounted seeing wooden houses, communal meals, and a clear hierarchy, suggesting a more sophisticated organization than simply a band of wild raiders. It wasn't quite the Hilton, but it served its purpose admirably. From this central base, Attila commanded an army of immense size and devastating capability. His core Hunnic warriors, renowned for their horsemanship and composite bows, formed the elite, but the vast majority of his forces were drawn from the various subjugated peoples: Goths, Gepids, Heruls, Alans, Rugians, and countless others. These allied contingents, often fighting under their own chieftains, but ultimately subservient to Attila, provided a diverse array of military skills, from heavy cavalry to infantry. This multi-ethnic army, united by fear and the promise of plunder, was perhaps the largest and most formidable barbarian force Europe had ever seen. Attila's policy towards the Roman empires, both east and west, was simple and direct. They were a source of unlimited wealth to be extracted through a combination of terrifying raids and humiliating tribute demands. He viewed the Romans not as equals, but as a vast, wealthy piggy bank that simply needed a bit of shaking to release its contents. He constantly escalated his demands, finding new pretexts for war if his requests were not met. A diplomatic slight, a disputed border territory, or the failure to return a Hunnic deserter could all serve as justification for a devastating invasion. The sheer scale of the tribute demanded by Attila was staggering. The Eastern Roman Empire, under Theodosius II, was compelled to pay enormous annual sums of gold, effectively crippling its economy. These payments were not just for peace, they were for the privilege of not being invaded. Attila would send his envoys to Constantinople, sometimes demanding further, one-off payments in addition to the annual tribute. This constant financial drain, combined with the devastating effects of Hunnic raids, severely weakened the Eastern Empire though its stronger economic base and formidable capital city allowed it to weather the storm more effectively than its western counterpart. The Western Roman Empire, under the weak emperor Valentinian III and the de facto rule of his powerful general Aetius, also felt the increasing pressure. Aetius, with his intimate knowledge of the Huns, largely pursued a policy of cautious diplomacy, often attempting to use Hunnic forces as mercenaries against his own rivals or other barbarian tribes. This was a precarious balancing act, relying on Aetius's personal relationship with some Hunnic leaders, but it was clear that even Aetius was essentially buying time. He knew that one wrong move, one perceived insult, and the full wrath of Attila could be unleashed upon the vulnerable provinces of the West. The fear inspired by Attila and his Huns was unparalleled. They were seen as a divine punishment, the scourge of God, sent to punish the sins of humanity. Their appearance, their speed, and their seemingly indiscriminate destruction fueled a pervasive sense of dread across Europe. Stories of their cruelty, whether entirely true or exaggerated by terrified chroniclers, spread like wildfire, painting a picture of an almost demonic force. This psychological warfare was a powerful weapon in itself, often causing cities to surrender without a fight, and entire populations to flee in panic at the mere rumor of their approach. It was quite effective, like a very aggressive, highly persuasive marketing campaign for terror. Historians still argue about the true nature of Attila's long-term goals. Was he simply interested in plunder and tribute, or did he harbor ambitions of establishing a settled empire in the Roman style? His actions suggest a focus on wealth extraction and military dominance, rather than administrative control or cultural assimilation. He wasn't interested in building cities or establishing lasting institutions. His genius lay in commanding vast, mobile armies and extracting resources from those who did. His empire was a testament to the raw power of nomadic warfare, a fleeting but utterly dominant force that reshaped the map of Europe through fear and conquest. The peak of his power was not measured in architectural marvels, but in the terrified silence that fell over a region when his name was spoken, and the immense piles of gold that regularly arrived at his nomadic court. With his power now consolidated, and the vast Hunnic confederation firmly under his sole command, Attila turned his formidable attention to the most lucrative, and in his eyes, most easily exploitable target, the Eastern Roman Empire. For years, the Eastern Empire, centered in the magnificent city of Constantinople, had paid increasingly burdensome tributes to the Huns, a policy that, while economically draining, had largely averted full-scale invasion. But Attila was not content with mere annual payments. His ambition knew no bounds, and he sought to extract every last ounce of wealth and submission from the wealthy eastern half of Rome. It was time, in his estimation, for a significant withdrawal from the Roman savings account, and he wasn't planning on using an ATM. His initial target in these major campaigns was the Balkan provinces of the Eastern Empire, rich in relatively accessible territories south of the Danube. These lands, including Thrace, Moesia, and Illyricum, had recovered somewhat from earlier Gothic depredations and were home to numerous prosperous cities and fertile agricultural areas. In 441 CE, Even before his full consolidation of power, Attila, along with Bleda, launched a massive campaign into these regions, shattering the fragile peace that had been purchased by prior tributes. This invasion was a clear signal that the Huns were no longer simply raiders, they were conquerors, systematically laying waste to vast swathes of Roman territory. The campaigns of 441, 442 CE were utterly devastating. Attila's forces swept through the Balkans like a wildfire, bypassing or overwhelming Roman garrisons. City after city fell to the Hunnic assault. Viminacium, Margus, Naissus, modern-day Nish, and Serdica, modern-day Sofia, were all besieged, sacked, and left in ruins. The Roman defenses, designed to counter conventional armies, were ill-equipped to deal with the speed, mobility, and overwhelming firepower of the Hunnic archers and the sheer numbers of their multi-ethnic army. The Huns employed their characteristic tactics, relentless volleys of arrows to break enemy formations, followed by swift, decisive charges, and then a brutal, systematic looting. They were not interested in holding territory in the long term, but in extracting as much wealth and human chattel as possible before moving on. The fall of Naissus was particularly illustrative of Hunnic efficiency. This strategically important city, a major crossroads in the Balkans, was heavily fortified. Yet the Huns, reportedly using siege engines, perhaps supplied or built by their subjugated subjects, or even by Roman defectors, systematically battered its walls. Once inside, they left little standing. The Roman historian Priscus, who visited Naissus years later, described it as a desolate wasteland, its streets choked with bones, a haunting testament to the Hunnic fury. This systematic destruction was not just about plunder. It was also a psychological weapon, a chilling message sent to Constantinople that no place was truly safe. Emperor Theodosius II once again found himself in a desperate situation. His treasury was already strained, and his armies were struggling to contain the Hunnic onslaught. He tried to negotiate, to appease, to divert. He even recalled troops from the Persian frontier to bolster his Balkan defenses, a desperate measure that risked exposing his eastern flank. But it was too little, too late. The Huns continued their relentless advance, pushing deeper into Roman territory, threatening even Constantinople itself. The eastern Roman capital, with its formidable Theodosian walls, was largely impregnable, but the hinterland, the very source of its wealth and manpower, was being systematically dismantled. The immediate consequence of these campaigns was a drastic increase in the tribute demanded by Attila. After a period of relentless pressure, Theodosius II was forced to accept a new, humiliating peace treaty. The annual tribute was not just doubled, but tripled from 700 pounds of gold to an astounding 2,100 pounds of gold, a truly crippling sum for the imperial treasury. In addition, the Romans were compelled to pay an immediate lump sum of 6,000 pounds of gold as arrears, essentially back pay for all the trouble Attila had taken to raid their lands. They also had to agree to further harsh terms, including the return of all Hunnic defectors and the establishment of a vast, uninhabited buffer zone south of the Danube, giving the Huns effective control over a wide strategic area. It was less a treaty and more a ransom note. This enormous financial burden had a profound impact on the Eastern Roman economy. Taxes had to be raised, resources diverted, and imperial projects curtailed. The common people felt the pinch, and the overall prosperity of the empire began to wane under the weight of Attila's demands. The Huns, meanwhile, used this vast influx of gold to acquire luxury goods, to reward their warriors, and to further consolidate their power, effectively turning Roman wealth into instruments of Roman subjugation. The campaigns against the Eastern Roman Empire were not just about plunder and tribute. They were also about demonstrating Attila's absolute power and deterring any thought of resistance. He wanted to make it unequivocally clear that he was the supreme authority in the region, and that Roman defiance would be met with swift and brutal consequences. The systematic devastation of cities and the massacre of their inhabitants served as a stark warning to any who considered standing against him. Historians still argue whether Attila's focus on the Eastern Roman Empire in these early years was a deliberate strategy to weaken Rome piece by piece, or simply a pragmatic choice based on its greater wealth and perceived vulnerability. It seems likely it was a combination of both. The Eastern Empire was indeed richer, and its administrative center, Constantinople, was a tempting, if difficult, prize. By bleeding the East dry, Attila was effectively removing one of the two major powers that could potentially challenge his hegemony in Europe. These early campaigns also served as a training ground for Attila's vast, multi-ethnic army, honing their collective fighting skills and reinforcing their loyalty through shared success and distributed plunder. The Hunnic Corps, though smaller in number, provided the strategic direction and the elite shock troops, while the numerous allied tribes provided the bulk of the manpower. This dynamic force, constantly enriched and reinforced by the wealth and manpower of its conquests, became an almost unstoppable juggernaut. The repeated humiliation and financial drain imposed by Attila left the Eastern Roman Empire in a precarious state. While Constantinople itself remained safe behind its walls, the vital provinces that supplied it with food, taxes, and soldiers were ravaged. Theodosius II, a pious but often indecisive emperor, found himself trapped in a cycle of appeasement, desperate to avoid further destruction. This period clearly demonstrated Attila's strategic acumen and his sheer military dominance. He wasn't just a barbarian chieftain. He was a master of grand strategy, capable of exerting immense pressure over vast distances and coercing even the mightiest empires to bend to his will. The stage was now set for even grander, more audacious campaigns, as Attila, having successfully squeezed the East, would soon turn his gaze westward towards a new, unsuspecting target. Having extracted a truly exorbitant ransom from the Eastern Roman Empire, effectively draining its coffers and leaving its Balkan provinces in ruins, Attila's focus now shifted to a more nuanced, yet equally predatory approach: diplomacy and deception with Constantinople. While the Huns were masters of warfare, Attila himself was no crude barbarian devoid of political cunning. He understood the power of psychological warfare, the utility of manipulating weaknesses, and the immense leverage he held over a Roman emperor desperate to avoid further devastation. This period was less about direct military confrontation and more about a prolonged game of chess, played with human lives and imperial gold as the pieces. Emperor Theodosius II still reeling from the crippling tribute imposed by Attila, sought to maintain a fragile peace, however humiliating. He continued to send lavish embassies to Attila's court, ostensibly to deliver the annual tribute, but also to gather intelligence, gauge Attila's intentions, and perhaps, just perhaps, to try and find a weakness. These embassies often included prominent Roman officials and scholars, such as the historian Priscus of Panium, whose detailed accounts provide invaluable, though often biased, insights into Attila's court and personality. Priscus's writings paint a vivid picture of a surprisingly orderly nomadic court, quite different from the wild, barbaric image often projected by Roman propaganda. He describes Attila himself as a man of simple habits but imposing presence, speaking softly but with absolute authority, a man who seemed to command deference without effort. Attila, for his part, used these diplomatic exchanges to his full advantage. He understood that the very act of Roman envoys humbling themselves before him, bearing gifts, and pleading for peace, further bolstered his prestige among his own people and sent a clear message to the world. Even the mighty Roman Empire bowed before the Huns. He would often receive the Roman ambassadors with a mixture of imperiousness and thinly veiled contempt, constantly raising new demands or finding trivial pretexts to accuse the Romans of violating the peace treaty. It was a sophisticated form of psychological torture designed to keep the Romans perpetually on edge, constantly fearing the next Hunnic demand or invasion. One recurring point of contention was the issue of Hunnic deserters. Attila insisted, often with threats of renewed warfare, that any Hunnic subjects who had fled to Roman territory be returned to him. This wasn't just about recovering individuals. It was about asserting his absolute authority and demonstrating that there was no safe refuge from his wrath. The Romans, despite the moral implications and the practical difficulties of apprehending scattered individuals, often felt compelled to comply, a humiliating testament to Attila's leverage. Imagine being an emperor and having to hand over refugees to their executioners simply to avoid a larger conflict. It wasn't exactly a proud moment in Roman diplomacy. Attila also frequently escalated his demands for tribute, often finding new excuses for arrears or for special one-off payments. He accused the Romans of failing to meet their treaty obligations, citing minor infractions or perceived slights. For example, he demanded that the Romans return certain pieces of land south of the Danube that he claimed were rightfully Hunnic territory, even though they were clearly within Roman provincial borders. These demands were often outrageous and designed to push the limits of Roman endurance, constantly testing how much they were willing to give to avoid war. The Roman court, meanwhile, was not entirely passive. While they paid the tribute, some elements within Constantinople also hatched a desperate plot to assassinate Attila. This conspiracy, recounted by Priscus, involved a Roman official named Edecon, who was a Hunnic envoy but secretly willing to betray Attila, and the eunuch Chrysaphius, a powerful figure in Theodosius II's court. The plan was to lure Attila into a trap and have him murdered. However, Attila, ever cunning and possessing an excellent intelligence network, uncovered the plot. He allowed the Roman envoys involved in the conspiracy to return home, but sent a chilling message to Theodosius II, revealing his knowledge of the assassination attempt and demanding that Chrysaphius be delivered to him. This exposed the depths of Roman desperation and Attila's remarkable ability to penetrate their secret machinations. It was a diplomatic equivalent of catching someone trying to pick your pocket, then calmly informing them that you knew all along. The discovery of the assassination plot only further emboldened Attila and increased his demands. Theodosius II, terrified by Attila's fury and the knowledge that his life was in danger, was forced to make even greater concessions. He had to execute Edecon, pay an immense additional sum of gold as an apology, and effectively admit his complicity in the plot. This humiliating episode severely damaged Roman prestige and further solidified Attila's position as the dominant power. It demonstrated that even covert attempts to remove him would fail and only lead to harsher penalties. Historians still argue about the precise motivations behind Attila's continued focus on the Eastern Roman Empire during this period. Was it simply a matter of easy money, or did he aim to systematically weaken it before turning his attention elsewhere? It seems plausible that he viewed the Eastern Empire as a vast, inexhaustible source of wealth that could fund his grander ambitions. By keeping Constantinople constantly off balance and financially drained, he ensured that they would be unable to challenge his growing dominance in Central Europe or interfere with his plans for the West. This cycle of raids, demands, and tribute payments effectively turned the Eastern Roman Empire into a client state of the Huns, albeit a very wealthy one. Theodosius II became a puppet, forced to dance to Attila's tune, sending him gold and bowing to his every whim. This continued until 450 CE, when Theodosius II died after a riding accident. His successor, Marcian, a more assertive and militarily capable emperor, immediately adopted a different stance. He famously declared that he would no longer pay tribute to Attila, stating that he had gold for his friends, but iron for his enemies. This abrupt change in Roman policy infuriated Attila, who saw it as a direct challenge to his authority and a deprivation of his rightful income. It was a bold gamble by Marcian, but one that would ultimately force Attila to look for new targets for his insatiable appetite for wealth and conquest. The long, drawn-out diplomatic dance with the East was over, and the music for a new, terrifying waltz with the West was about to begin. With the Eastern Roman Empire, under the defiant new leadership of Emperor Marcian, now refusing to pay its customary and rather crippling tribute, Attila found his well-established financial pipeline abruptly shut off. This was a significant strategic shift, an unexpected challenge to his long-held policy of simply extorting gold from Constantinople. His demands for tribute had been met with the chilling response of iron for his enemies, which, while perhaps a brave stance from Marcian, certainly didn't help Attila's cash flow. Faced with this defiant posture in the East, and always on the lookout for new sources of wealth and glory, Attila began to turn his gaze westward, towards the more vulnerable and politically fractured Western Roman Empire. The Western Roman Empire, with its nominal capital at Ravenna and its true power often residing with strong military generals, was in a far more precarious state than its eastern counterpart. It was plagued by internal political intrigues, a weakening central authority, and provinces that were increasingly beyond imperial control, often dominated by barbarian federati or local strongmen. It was, in essence, a ripe fruit, ready for the plucking, especially compared to the formidable walls and vast wealth of Constantinople, which had just rudely slammed its doors. Attila, ever the opportunist, found not one but several convenient pretexts to justify his momentous invasion of Gaul. It wasn't just a simple desire for plunder, though that was certainly a powerful motivator. He was a master of fabricating grievances, twisting diplomatic slights into grand justifications for war, and in the convoluted world of Roman imperial politics, he found ample material to work with. One of the primary catalysts for Attila's invasion was a rather scandalous and highly unusual plea from a Roman princess, Honoria. She was the sister of the Western Roman Emperor Valentinian III, and a woman of considerable spirit who chafed under the restrictions of court life and her brother's overbearing control. In a dramatic gesture of defiance and perhaps desperation, Honoria sent a ring to Attila in 450 CE, accompanied by a message that could be interpreted as a marriage proposal. This was less a romantic overture and more a calculated political move, an attempt to escape a forced marriage to a Roman senator and gain independent power. She was essentially trying to pull off the ancient world's most audacious mail-order bride scheme, with the groom being the most feared man in Europe. Attila, seizing upon this golden opportunity, interpreted Honoria's gesture as a legitimate marriage proposal and, crucially, a claim to a share of the Western Roman Empire. He immediately demanded Honoria as his bride and half of the Western Empire as her dowry. This was, of course, an outrageous demand, far beyond anything the Romans could or would concede, but it provided Attila with a perfect, high-profile pretext for invasion. He could now claim he was merely asserting his rightful claim and protecting his prospective bride. It was a brilliant piece of propaganda, turning a personal slight into a grand imperial grievance. Another contributing factor was a complex dynastic dispute among the Franks, a powerful Germanic people settled along the Rhine River, who were partly within and partly outside Roman influence. Two rival Frankish princes appealed to Attila for support. Attila, always eager to sow discord and exploit internal divisions, chose to support one of the claimants, thereby gaining a convenient reason to march his massive army into Gaul. It allowed him to portray himself not just as a conqueror, but as an arbiter of justice, albeit a rather heavily armed one. Furthermore, there was the ongoing tension with the powerful Roman general Aetius, the de facto ruler of the Western Empire. Aetius, as we remember, had a unique history with the Huns, having spent time among them as a hostage and even using Hunnic mercenaries to secure his own power. For years, he had managed to maintain a fragile peace with the Huns, largely through careful diplomacy and no doubt some well-placed payments. However, the relationship was always fraught with mistrust, and Attila likely saw Aetius as the only significant military obstacle in the West. It was a rivalry between the two most powerful military figures of their time, a clash of titans waiting to happen. By 451 CE, Attila had assembled an army of truly colossal proportions. Sources speak of hundreds of thousands of warriors, though these numbers are almost certainly exaggerated. Nevertheless, It was a multi-ethnic force comprising his Hunnic corps, along with vast contingents of Gepids, Ostrogoths, who, remember, had been subjugated by the Huns, Rugians, Siri, Heruls, Thuringians, and many other Germanic and nomadic tribes. This massive army, a swirling vortex of different languages and fighting styles, began its westward march, crossing the Rhine into Gaul. The sheer scale of the invasion must have been terrifying to behold, a human tide washing over the landscape. Their advance was swift and brutal. Cities fell in quick succession. Metz was utterly destroyed, its inhabitants massacred or enslaved. Trier and Reims suffered similar fates. The Hunnic host left a trail of desolation in its wake, instilling terror wherever they went. Their tactics remained the same: overwhelming numbers, relentless arrow fire, and a brutal efficiency in sacking and destroying settlements. They weren't interested in occupation in the long term, but in plunder and destruction, a rather efficient business model for a nomadic conqueror. The immediate goal for Attila in Gaul appears to have been the capture of Orléans, a strategically vital city on the Loire River. Orléans commanded the crossing points of the Loire, and its capture would have given Attila a secure base for further operations, potentially allowing him to march south into the rich provinces of Aquitaine, or even to turn towards the crucial Roman strongholds further west. It was a key choke point, and Attila knew its importance. The arrival of Attila's forces in Gaul finally spurred Aetius into action. Despite the internal divisions and the long-standing animosity between Rome and the Visigoths, Aetius understood the existential threat posed by Attila. He embarked on a frantic diplomatic mission to forge an alliance with his old enemies, the Visigoths, who had by this point established a powerful kingdom in Aquitaine under their aging but formidable king, Theodoric III. It was a testament to the scale of the Hunnic threat that these two historical adversaries, Rome and the Visigoths, found themselves forced to unite against a common, greater enemy. The survival of Europe, it seemed, depended on this most unlikely of alliances. The stage was now set for a confrontation of epic proportions, a clash that would determine the fate of the Western Roman Empire and, arguably, the future of Europe itself. The relentless advance of Attila's forces through Gaul, leaving a swathe of destruction and terror in their wake, finally forced the fragmented powers of the Western Roman Empire and its long-standing Gothic adversaries to put aside their differences and confront the overwhelming threat. The strategic importance of Orléans, positioned as it was on the vital Loire River, became the focal point of the unfolding drama. Attila knew that securing this city would unlock the rich southern provinces of Gaul for his devastating raids, and so he pressed his siege with characteristic intensity. The citizens of Orléans, along with their Roman defenders, braced themselves for the inevitable, knowing that surrender likely meant slaughter and enslavement. Meanwhile, the aging but still remarkably astute Roman general Attius, the de facto power behind the Western Roman throne, was engaged in a desperate race against time. He understood, perhaps better than anyone in the Roman world, the true nature of the Hunnic threat, having spent years among them as a hostage in his youth. His intimate knowledge of their tactics and their leaders made him uniquely qualified to oppose them, but he lacked the sheer manpower to face Attila's massive, multi-ethnic army alone. His only hope lay in forging an unlikely alliance, one that just a few years prior would have seemed utterly inconceivable. Aetius turned to his old adversaries, the Visigoths, who had established a powerful and increasingly independent kingdom in southwestern Gaul with their capital at Tolosa, modern Toulouse. Their king was Theodoric I, a venerable and experienced warrior who had seen many campaigns against Rome and other barbarian tribes. Despite decades of intermittent warfare and deep-seated mistrust, Aetius managed to persuade Theodoric of the existential danger posed by Attila. It was a testament to Aetius's diplomatic skill and the sheer terror inspired by the Huns that these two formidable powers, who had so often been at each other's throats, finally agreed to unite. The fate of Gaul, and perhaps even Rome itself, hinged on this precarious alliance. Think of it as two rival gang leaders suddenly realizing a much bigger, scarier gang was about to move into their neighborhood, forcing them to reluctantly shake hands. The combined forces of the Romans and Visigoths marched swiftly to relieve Orleans. Their timely arrival prevented the city from falling, forcing Attila to lift his siege and withdraw eastward into the open plains of Champagne, where his superior cavalry could operate more effectively. This was a tactical retreat, not a defeat, but it denied Attila a crucial strategic objective and set the stage for the direct confrontation that would follow. The two vast armies finally converged in late June of 451 CE on the Catalonian plains, a large, flat expanse of land in northeastern Gaul near modern-day Châlons-en-Champagne. The precise location of this epic clash remains a subject of scholarly debate, with various theories placing it in different areas within the region, much like arguing over the exact spot where a particularly famous snowball fight took place, centuries after the snow has melted. What is certain, however, is the immense scale of the battle and the sheer number of combatants involved. Attila's army was a colossal force, composed of his Hunnic corps, the massive contingents of subjugated Ostrogoths under their kings Valamir, Theodomir, and Vidomir, as well as Gepids, Rugians, Siri, Heruls, Thuringians, and various Frankish factions. On the other side, the allied Roman and Visigothic army was a diverse coalition as well, led by Aetius and Theodoric. It included Roman legions, what few remained, Visigothic heavy cavalry and infantry, Salian Franks, Alemanni, Burgundians, and other Celtic and Germanic auxiliaries. It was arguably one of the largest battles ever fought on European soil up to that point, a true clash of civilizations. The battle itself was a chaotic, bloody affair, lasting through much of the day. The ground would have thundered with the hooves of thousands of horses, the air thick with the whistle of Hunnic arrows and the clash of steel. The Huns, with their renowned mobility, would have employed their classic tactics, volleys of arrows to soften up enemy lines, feigned retreats to draw opponents into traps, and swift, enveloping maneuvers. The Visigoths, on the other hand, were famed for their heavy cavalry charges, capable of smashing through enemy formations, while the Roman infantry provided a disciplined, if somewhat static, corps. It was a brutal dance between overwhelming speed and unyielding resilience. A crucial moment in the battle occurred when the Visigothic king Theodoric I, leading a charge, was unhorsed and trampled to death by his own men in the chaotic melee. This could have spelled disaster for the Allied forces, but his son, Thorismund, immediately took command and rallied his people with furious resolve. The Visigoths, fighting now with a desperate vengeance for their fallen king, pressed the attack even harder, illustrating the fiercely personal nature of leadership and loyalty in these ancient armies. Historians still argue about who truly won the Battle of the Ilonian Plains. The fighting was incredibly fierce, and both sides suffered immense casualties. Accounts vary wildly, but the general consensus is that the battle ended in a bloody stalemate, with neither side achieving a decisive victory. Attila's forces were certainly halted, and his westward advance was checked. He was prevented from achieving his objective of further conquest in Gaul, and his reputation for invincibility was dented, if not entirely shattered. The Romans and Visigoths had achieved their primary goal, to stop Attila. It was less a knockout punch and more a very drawn-out, exhausting wrestling match where no one truly came out looking pretty. After the battle, Attila withdrew his forces to his fortified wagon lager, a defensive circle of wagons, where he prepared for a renewed assault or a defensive stand. Aetius, however, perhaps wary of sustaining further heavy casualties, or perhaps subtly manipulating the Visigoths, chose not to press the attack. He even encouraged the Visigoths, particularly Thorismund, to return to their kingdom in Toulouse, fearing that a complete Hunnic defeat might lead to an overpowerful Visigothic state that would then pose a new threat to Rome. It was a subtle, Machiavellian move by Aetius, always playing the long game, even in the immediate aftermath of such a monumental conflict. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains, though perhaps not a decisive tactical victory for either side, was a profound strategic triumph for the Roman-Visigothic alliance. It was the moment when Attila's seemingly unstoppable advance was finally checked, a pivotal engagement that prevented the Hunnic Empire from establishing a lasting foothold in Western Europe. It marked the high-water mark of Hunnic power in the West and preserved for a time the fragile remnants of Roman authority in Gaul. While Attila would soon turn his attention elsewhere, the plains of Champagne would forever be associated with the grinding, bloody struggle that against all odds managed to halt the scourge of God. The Catalonian Plains, that vast, blood-soaked expanse in Gaul, had witnessed a monumental clash, a grinding, desperate struggle that, while not a decisive victory for either side, undeniably marked a strategic turning point. Attila, for the first time in his reign, had been thwarted in a major objective. His reputation for invincibility, though still formidable, was now slightly less burnished. His grand ambition of systematically conquering Gaul had been checked, and the combined forces of the Romans and Visigoths had proved that the scourge of God could in fact be stopped. This wasn't a defeat in the sense of a rout, but it certainly wasn't the triumphant march through Gaul he had envisioned. In the immediate aftermath in Gaul, Attila wisely chose not to press his luck against the still formidable allied forces. His army, though immense, had suffered heavy casualties, and his strategic objectives in Gaul had been denied. He lingered for a short time, gathering his forces and tending to his wounded, but it was clear that the campaign in Gaul had reached an impasse. Rather than risk another costly and potentially indecisive battle, Attila opted to withdraw his forces eastward across the Rhine back to the relative safety of his Pannonian heartland. It was a strategic retreat, a recognition that the immediate spoils in Gaul were not worth the continued attrition against a newly invigorated, if still fragile, alliance. He knew when to cut his losses, even if it meant leaving a few untouched villages behind. However, Attila was not one to be easily deterred or to leave a campaign unfinished. The failure to decisively conquer Gaul simply redirected his insatiable ambition towards a new, equally tempting, and perhaps even more vulnerable target: Italy. If Gaul proved too tough a nut to crack this year, then the heartland of the Western Roman Empire, with its rich cities and perceived weakness, might offer easier pickings. He viewed the Roman Empire, both east and west, as a vast reservoir of wealth, and if one tap was turned off, he would simply open another. The reasons for Attila's pivot to Italy were manifold. Firstly, the Western Roman Emperor Valentinian III and his general Aetius had defied him, denying him Honoria and her supposed dowry, and then daring to stand against him at the Catalonian plains. This was a direct affront to Attila's honor and prestige, and he was not one to forget or forgive such slights. Secondly, the lucrative tribute from the Eastern Empire under Marcian had been cut off, leaving Attila in need of new sources of plunder to satisfy his warriors and maintain the cohesion of his multi-ethnic confederation. Raiding Italy offered the prospect of immense wealth, a fresh payout to keep his army happy and loyal. It was an executive decision, really, shifting corporate strategy from European expansion to domestic acquisition. In 452 CE, Attila launched his massive invasion of Italy, crossing the Julian Alps into the fertile plains of Venetia. This invasion was a brutal demonstration of Hunnic power, driven by a desire for vengeance and vast amounts of loot. The Western Roman Empire was ill-prepared to resist him. Its military resources were stretched thin, its internal politics were a mess, and its best general, Aetius, had just fought a grinding campaign in Gaul. The formidable defenses that once protected Italy had largely fallen into disrepair, and the legions stationed there were insufficient to halt Attila's overwhelming force. The first major city to fall was Aquileia, a large and prosperous Roman city located at the head of the Adriatic Sea and a key strategic hub. Attila besieged the city with his entire army, and the defenders, despite a courageous resistance, were ultimately overwhelmed. The Hunnic assault was relentless, and when the walls finally breached, the city was subjected to a horrific sack. Attila reportedly ordered its complete destruction, leaving it in such ruins that later generations struggled to even locate its exact site. This act was not just plunder, it was a deliberate act of terror meant to send an unequivocal message to the rest of Italy. Resistance was futile, and only utter destruction awaited those who defied the scourge of God. It was a rather dramatic and permanent way of leaving a calling card. From Aquileia, Attila's army continued its destructive march through the rich Po Valley. City after city fell victim to the Hunnic fury. Patavium, Padua, Verona, Brixia, Brescia, and Bergamo, were all sacked and pillaged. The rich agricultural lands were laid waste, and their inhabitants were either slaughtered or carried off into slavery. The sight and sound of the Hunnic horde must have been utterly terrifying. The dust clouds raised by thousands of hooves, the barbaric cries, the relentless showering of arrows, and the inevitable conflagration that followed their departure. It was a nightmare made real for the Roman populace. The destruction of these cities led directly to the founding of a new one, a subtle but significant historical consequence. Many of the inhabitants of the ravaged mainland cities fled to the marshy lagoons and islands off the Adriatic coast, seeking refuge from the Hunnic onslaught. These refugees established permanent settlements on the islands, which would eventually grow into the magnificent city of Venice. So, in a strange, roundabout way, Attila can be credited with providing the impetus for the creation of one of the world's most unique and beautiful cities. Perhaps he never intended to, but history works in mysterious ways, occasionally building something beautiful from utter devastation. Attila's forces then continued their southward drive, setting their sights on Mediolanum, modern Milan, which had served as a capital of the Western Roman Empire for a period, and was still a city of considerable wealth and importance. Milan, unlike Aquileia, did not suffer total destruction, but it was thoroughly sacked. Attila entered the city and reportedly made a point of taking up residence in the former imperial palace. Here, he encountered a painting depicting the Roman emperors seated on their thrones with the defeated Scythians, a general term often used for steppe peoples, lying prostrate at their feet. Attila, with his characteristic arrogance and theatrical flair, ordered the painting altered. He had himself depicted on the throne, with the Roman emperors piling sacks of gold at his feet. It was a clear visual declaration of his perceived supremacy, a rather blunt way of saying, "I'm in charge now." What? The sheer audacity and devastating effectiveness of Attila's Italian invasion were profound. The Western Roman Empire, already teetering on the brink, found itself utterly exposed. There was no Aetius-led coalition this time, no formidable army to meet Attila in a decisive pitched battle. The traditional Roman defenses had failed, and the imperial court in Ravenna was paralyzed by fear and indecision. The scourge of God was now loose in the very heartland of Italy, threatening the historical core of Roman civilization itself. The question was no longer if he would be stopped, but how, and at what cost. The road to Rome itself seemed wide open, and the fate of the eternal city hung in the balance. The devastation wrought by Attila's forces in northern Italy was absolute, a chilling testament to the Hunnic capacity for destruction and a stark reminder of the Western Roman Empire's crumbling defenses. Aquileia lay in ruins, its very memory almost erased, and the fertile Po Valley was a wasteland of pillaged cities and desolated farmlands. Mediolanum, Milan, had been thoroughly stripped of its wealth, and its imperial palace desecrated by Attila's symbolic rearrangement of historical frescoes. The path to Rome, the ancient and venerable heart of the empire, seemed terrifyingly open, with only a few meager garrisons and the crippled authority of Emperor Valentinian III standing in the way. It truly seemed like the world was holding its breath, waiting for the final, inevitable blow. Yet, despite the clear path and the apparent vulnerability of Rome, Attila made a surprising decision. He did not sack the Eternal City. Instead, he chose to withdraw his forces from Italy, leaving Rome intact, albeit deeply shaken. This unexpected turn of events has puzzled historians for centuries and remains a topic of considerable scholarly debate. One of the most famous and enduring explanations for this withdrawal involves the dramatic intervention of Pope Leo I. In the summer of 452 CE, as Attila's army advanced, a delegation of high-ranking Roman officials and religious figures, including the formidable Pope Leo the prefect Trigetius, and the former consul Avienus, traveled north to meet Attila at his camp near the Mincio River. The purpose of this embassy was clear: to plead with Attila to spare Rome. Pope Leo, a man of immense moral authority and diplomatic skill, is famously depicted by later chroniclers as standing fearlessly before the feared Hunnic king, appealing to his mercy and perhaps even invoking divine wrath if he dared to touch the holy city. The traditional narrative, popularized by later Christian writers, describes a miraculous intervention. It suggests that Leo's eloquent pleas and his imposing spiritual presence, perhaps combined with divine inspiration, convinced Attila to turn back. Some accounts even claimed that the apostles Peter and Paul appeared alongside Leo, threatening Attila with heavenly retribution if he dared to harm Rome. While this makes for a compelling, cinematic tale, and certainly underscores the growing power and prestige of the papacy in the declining West, modern historians tend to approach such divine interventions with a gentle dose of skepticism, preferring to look for more pragmatic, earthly reasons. After all, if the Pope could simply scare off vast armies with a stern talking to, a lot of history might have unfolded rather differently. Indeed, there were several very practical reasons that likely contributed to Attila's decision to withdraw from Italy. Firstly, his army was likely suffering from a severe plague outbreak. The Huns, accustomed to the dry, open steppes, were particularly susceptible to the diseases prevalent in the more humid and densely populated Italian peninsula. The flat, marshy lowlands of the Po Valley, ravaged by war and overflowing with unburied dead, would have been a perfect breeding ground for disease. A large portion of his forces, particularly the allied Germanic contingents, might have been decimated by sickness, severely weakening his army and making further sustained campaigning unsustainable. A general who loses half his army to dysentery tends to be less keen on continuing the war. Secondly, Attila's army was probably facing severe supply shortages. The systematic destruction of northern Italy meant that the land itself had been thoroughly stripped of resources. There was little left to forage, and the logistical challenges of feeding a massive army, composed of thousands of warriors and even more horses, in a devastated landscape, would have been immense. Their nomadic lifestyle made them adept at living off the land, but even they had limits, especially in a region they had just finished laying waste to. It was a rather unfortunate side effect of their own success. Thirdly, the Eastern Roman Emperor Marcian, remember him, the one who refused to pay tribute? Well, he had been busy. While Attila was preoccupied in Italy, Marcian had sent an army to invade Hunnic territory across the Danube, posing a direct threat to Attila's Pannonian heartland. This diversionary attack would have been a serious concern for Attila, threatening his home base and potentially compelling him to withdraw to defend his core territories. It was a clever strategic move by Marcian, proving that sometimes, Even a defensive posture can be aggressive. Finally, Attila's own priorities might have played a role. He was not primarily interested in conquering and administering vast territories in the Roman style. His goal was plunder, tribute, and the demonstration of his absolute power. He had already devastated much of northern Italy and extracted immense wealth. Perhaps, having made his point and facing disease and supply issues, he decided that further gains in Italy were not worth the potential losses, especially with the Eastern Empire now openly challenging him. Rome, though a symbolic prize, might have been seen as more trouble than it was worth, especially if a prolonged siege would further weaken his plague-ridden forces. Historians still argue about the relative weight of these factors, and whether Pope Leo's intervention truly had any persuasive power or was simply a convenient, face-saving opportunity for Attila to justify a withdrawal he had already decided upon for pragmatic reasons. Regardless of the exact sequence of influence, the fact remains that Attila, the scourge of God, retreated from Italy, leaving Rome miraculously untouched. This event further cemented Pope Leo's reputation and became a foundational story for the growing authority of the Roman Church. It was undoubtedly a momentous decision, one that spared Rome from the fate of Aquileia and countless other cities, preserving a legacy that might otherwise have been utterly destroyed. The Hunnic tide, after reaching its high water mark, was beginning its slow, deliberate ebb. The unexpected withdrawal from Italy, leaving Rome miraculously untouched, marked a subtle but significant shift in Attila's trajectory. It was the first major campaign where his objectives were not fully realized, and his army had suffered significant losses, not just from battle, but more likely from the ravages of disease and the relentless logistical strain. While his reputation for terror remained undimmed and the Roman world still trembled at his name, the aura of his invincibility had begun to show its first hairline cracks. This period marked the concluding phase of his remarkable and terrifying life, leading to an end as mysterious as his origins. After withdrawing from Italy in 452 CE, Attila returned to his nomadic heartland in the Pannonian Basin in what is now modern-day Hungary. He spent the remainder of that year and the early part of 453 CE consolidating his power, dealing with internal tribal issues, and no doubt planning his next grand campaign. His insatiable desire for wealth and conquest remained undiminished, even if his immediate plans for the Western Roman Empire had been temporarily frustrated. He likely viewed the Italian campaign as a successful raid for plunder, even if it didn't end with Rome burning, and was now focused on replenishing his resources and preparing for new ventures. The Eastern Roman Empire, under the defiant Emperor Marcian, continued to refuse tribute. This open challenge to his authority infuriated Attila. He regarded Marcian's stance as a grave insult and a breach of the long-standing and very lucrative agreements. Therefore, in 453 CE, Attila began to gather his vast, multi-ethnic army once more, intending to launch a massive, punitive campaign against Constantinople. He sent menacing messages to Marcian, declaring that he would show the world what he would do to those who defied him. It was a clear declaration of intent. The Eastern Roman Empire would pay, one way or another, and the price would be in blood and ruin. This wasn't going to be a polite negotiation over tea and biscuits. However, this grand campaign was never launched. In a sudden and utterly unexpected turn of events, Attila died in 453 CE. The circumstances of his death are shrouded in mystery and various conflicting accounts, adding to the legendary aura that surrounded him even in his lifetime. The most widely accepted account comes from the Roman historian Priscus, who had actually visited Attila's court. Priscus states that Attila had recently taken a new, young bride named Ildiko, presumably a Germanic princess from one of his subjugated tribes. On their wedding night, after a night of revelry and feasting, Attila suffered a severe nosebleed and, being heavily intoxicated, choked to death in his sleep. Imagine the scene. The most feared man in the world, the scourge of God, brought low not by a Roman sword or a Gothic spear, but by a simple nosebleed and too much celebrating. It's certainly a rather anticlimactic end for such a formidable figure. Some historians have suggested other possibilities, including a cerebral hemorrhage, a burst blood vessel due to excessive drinking, or even an internal hemorrhage exacerbated by his lifestyle. It sounds almost mundane, doesn't it? A man who terrorized continents, undone by a common bodily function. However, other, more dramatic accounts of his death emerged. One popular legend, recorded by the Gothic historian Jordanus, writing a century later, suggests that Ildiko herself murdered Attila to avenge her people, a classic tale of a vengeful bride. This narrative, while compelling and fitting with the dramatic nature of his life, lacks direct contemporary evidence and is generally considered less likely by modern scholars. But it certainly adds a touch of femme fatale to the Hunnic story, giving it a dramatic flair that a simple nosebleed just can't quite achieve. Regardless of the precise cause, Attila's death was kept a closely guarded secret for a time by his immediate retinue, likely to prevent immediate chaos and preserve the fragile unity of the Hunnic Confederation. When the news finally broke, the reaction among his warriors was one of profound grief and ritualized mourning. They reportedly cut their hair, gashed their faces, and rode their horses around his funeral tent, expressing their sorrow not with tears, but with blood, believing that such a great warrior should not be mourned with effeminate weeping. His body was placed in a triple coffin of gold, silver, and iron, and buried in a secret location, along with immense treasures, beneath the bed of a diverted river. The river was then returned to its course, and all those involved in the burial were killed, ensuring that his final resting place would remain a mystery, forever protecting his legendary status and the vast riches buried with him. It's the ancient world's version of a perfectly executed, top-secret operation. Attila's death, though sudden, was immensely significant. It immediately removed the singular, driving force behind the Hunnic Empire's relentless expansion and cohesion. He had been the linchpin, the charismatic leader who had bound together dozens of disparate tribes under his iron will. Without his unifying presence, the vast Hunnic Confederation, built on conquest and personal loyalty to its supreme ruler, was destined to unravel. His final years had seen him consolidate an empire that stretched from the steppes to the Rhine, humble the proud Eastern Roman Empire, and challenge the very existence of the West. He had pushed the boundaries of what a nomadic power could achieve, extracting immense wealth and fear from the most powerful empires of his day. His campaigns had sent shockwaves across Europe, initiating mass migrations and fundamentally reshaping the political and demographic landscape of the continent. The Scourge of God had lived up to his fearsome epithet, leaving a legacy of destruction and a lingering sense of dread. But with his abrupt departure, the great Hunnic storm that had swept over Europe began its swift and inevitable dissipation. The Roman world, battered and bruised, could finally begin to breathe, uncertain of what new challenges lay ahead, but at least for now, free from the immediate terror of Attila. Attila's sudden and unexpected death, the silent disappearance of the Scourge of God in the quiet of his wedding tent, immediately plunged the vast Hunnic Empire into a profound succession crisis. The empire, forged by Attila's singular will and held together by his immense personal authority, lacked any established system of inheritance or administrative bureaucracy. It was a military confederation, not a dynastic monarchy with clear rules of succession. This absence of a clear transition plan was a fatal flaw, a design oversight that would prove to be its undoing, much like building a magnificent house without a proper foundation. Attila had numerous sons, each ambitious and eager to claim their father's mantle. Among the most prominent were Elek, Dengizich, and Ernak. However, none possessed the overwhelming charisma, strategic genius, or ruthless efficacy that had defined Attila's rule. They were, in essence, trying to fill shoes that were several sizes too big, and they all wanted to fill them at the same time. The unity that Attila had so painstakingly enforced, often through brute force and intimidation, quickly began to unravel as his sons squabbled over their inheritance. The Hunnic custom, or at least a common practice among nomadic confederations, was for an empire to be divided among the sons of the deceased ruler. This often led to immediate internal strife, as each son sought to assert his own dominance and claim the largest share of the inheritance, not just of land, but of subject peoples and accumulated wealth. For Attila's sons, this meant vying for control over the vast array of Germanic, Alanic, and Slavic tribes that formed the backbone of the Hunnic military and provided its constant supply of tribute and manpower. It was a rather brutal form of sibling rivalry, with entire nations as the stakes. The allied and subjugated tribes, who had only remained loyal to the Hunnic core out of fear of Attila himself, immediately sensed the weakening of the central authority. They had resented the Hunnic yoke, the constant demands for tribute, and the forced military service. Now, with the great unifier gone, and his sons demonstrating a distinct lack of their father's commanding presence, the opportunity for rebellion was too tempting to resist. It was like a schoolyard full of bullies suddenly losing their intimidating leader. Everyone who had been picked on before saw their chance for payback. The first to openly challenge Hunnic rule were the Gepids, a powerful Germanic tribe under their shrewd and ambitious king, Ardaric. The Gepids had been significant allies of the Huns, and their warriors had fought bravely under Attila at the Catalonian plains. However, they had also endured decades of Hunnic dominance and likely harbored deep resentment. Ardaric, a formidable leader in his own right, saw the succession crisis as his moment to break free and forge an independent kingdom. He rallied other discontented Germanic tribes, including the Ostrogoths, who had a particular axe to grind, having been subjugated by the Huns for so long, the Rugians, the Syrii, and the Herulls, to form a powerful coalition against the Hunnic overlords. This widespread revolt was further exacerbated by the Hunnic sons' own infighting. Instead of presenting a united front against the rebellious subject peoples, they continued to bicker amongst themselves, diverting crucial military resources and manpower to internal squabbles. Elik, the eldest son, initially attempted to assert his authority over his brothers and the revolting tribes. He was perhaps the most capable of Attila's immediate successors, but he lacked the almost mythical aura that had protected his father. The fragmentation of the Hunnic Empire was incredibly swift. It was a stark contrast to the slow, relentless rise of Attila. What had taken decades to build, based on one man's will and terror, disintegrated in a matter of months. The various tribal groups that had made up the Hunnic army suddenly realized that their loyalty was no longer to a single, terrifying figure, but to squabbling, less competent heirs. This realization emboldened them, giving them the courage to reclaim their autonomy. The Roman empires, both East and West, observed this unfolding drama with a mix of cautious optimism and strategic maneuvering. Emperor Marcian in the East, who had famously refused Attila tribute, now saw his gamble pay off spectacularly. He largely adopted a hands-off approach, allowing the barbarian tribes to exhaust themselves fighting each other, a classic Roman strategy of letting your enemies weaken themselves. The Western Roman Empire, still reeling from Attila's Italian invasion, was too weak to intervene decisively, but certainly welcomed the disintegration of their most fearsome enemy. Historians still argue about the exact sequence of events during this period of rapid decline, given the scarcity of detailed contemporary sources. However, the general trajectory is clear. The Hunnic Empire, once a monolithic threat, was rapidly breaking apart under the weight of its own internal contradictions and the resentment of its subjugated peoples. The very strength of Attila's personal rule proved to be the ultimate weakness of his empire. It could not outlive its creator. The immediate consequence of the succession crisis and widespread rebellion was the decisive Battle of Nidau in 454 CE, a pivotal moment that we will explore in detail in the next section. This battle was not just a skirmish, it was a massive confrontation that effectively sealed the fate of the Hunnic Empire. It was a war of liberation for the Germanic tribes, a desperate struggle for freedom against their former masters. The Hunnic leadership, fragmented and weakened by infighting, found itself facing a united and highly motivated coalition of its former subjects. The vast empire that Attila had created, built on the foundations of fear and plunder, was now collapsing in on itself, much like a sand castle slowly washed away by the tide. The legacy of Attila, for all his terrifying power, was proving to be as fleeting as the nomadic winds that had carried his people across the steppes. The thunderous echo of the Battle of Nidau, where the Hunnic Empire effectively collapsed in a bloody heap, marked the final, decisive end of their political and military dominance in Europe. But while the empire itself dissolved with surprising swiftness, the legacy of the Huns was far from ephemeral. Their destructive campaigns and their very presence had sent shockwaves across the continent, initiating a cascade of events that profoundly reshaped the course of European history. It was as if a massive boulder had fallen into a pond. The ripples continued to spread long after the initial splash had subsided. One of the most immediate and profound impacts of the Huns was their role as a catalyst for the Great Migrations, often referred to as the barbarian invasions. As we remember, the initial Hunnic push into Europe dislodged the Goths from their homelands, forcing them to seek refuge within the Roman Empire. This, in turn, put immense pressure on Rome's borders and resources, directly leading to events like the Battle of Adrianople and the eventual sack of Rome by the Visigoths. The Huns didn't just conquer, they displaced, setting in motion a chain reaction of tribal movements that fundamentally altered the demographic and political landscape of Europe. Without the Huns as the initial, terrifying push, the historical trajectory of the 4th and 5th centuries would likely have been entirely different, perhaps less chaotic, perhaps less swift in its transformation. It's like blaming a traffic jam on the car that stalled 3 miles up the road, rather than just the one in front of you. The constant pressure exerted by the Huns and the subsequent chaos of the migration period they initiated undeniably contributed to the fall of the Western Roman Empire. While historians still argue that Rome's decline was multifaceted, involving economic woes, internal political instability, and overextension, the Hunnic presence certainly exacerbated these existing weaknesses. The need to divert vast resources to defense and tribute payments, the loss of fertile provinces to devastation, and the psychological demoralization of the populace all chipped away at Rome's ability to sustain itself. The Huns might not have delivered the final death blow, but they certainly pushed Rome closer to the edge of the cliff, like a persistent, well-aimed shove. Furthermore, the Huns indirectly influenced the rise of new Germanic kingdoms across Europe. The very tribes they had subjugated, like the Ostrogoths and Gepids, were, upon their liberation after Nidau, free to establish their own powerful states in the former Roman territories. The Ostrogoths, under Theodoric the Great, would eventually establish a sophisticated kingdom in Italy, while the Visigoths would found kingdoms in Gaul and Spain. These new political entities, forged in the crucible of migration and conflict, laid the foundations for many of the modern nations of Europe. The Huns, in their destructive path, inadvertently cleared the way for a new, post-Roman order. It's a bit ironic, isn't it? The destroyers of old paved the way for the new. Beyond geopolitics, the Huns left a lasting imprint on European folklore and collective memory. Their terrifying reputation endured for centuries. In Germanic sagas and Norse myths, figures resembling Attila appear as powerful, often cruel, but sometimes admirable kings. In the famous Nibelungenlied, a medieval German epic, Attila, Etzel, is portrayed as a mighty but somewhat naive king, contrasting with the fierce warrior of historical accounts. This transformation from scourge of God to a more complex, even slightly sympathetic character in literature shows the enduring fascination with his figure. In Hungary, the Huns, and particularly Attila, were later adopted as national ancestors, despite historical evidence suggesting a complex, multi-ethnic origin for the Hungarians that has little to do with the Huns. This adoption was largely a romanticized notion, an attempt to connect a powerful medieval kingdom to a legendary, fearsome past. It's a good example of how history can be reinterpreted to serve modern national identities, creating a legendary lineage where historical facts might be a little fuzzier than desired. The Roman fascination, or rather terror, with the Huns also contributed to their enduring presence in intellectual discourse. Roman and Greek historians, deeply affected by the Hunnic invasions, wrote extensively about them, often with a mix of horror and grudging admiration for their military prowess. These accounts, though colored by fear and prejudice, are our primary sources for understanding the Huns and their impact. They shaped how subsequent generations viewed these nomadic warriors, creating a powerful narrative of a barbaric force that challenged the very foundations of civilization. The military innovations and tactics employed by the Huns also left a mark. Their unparalleled use of mounted archers and their emphasis on speed and mobility forced Roman and Germanic armies to adapt their own strategies. While the Romans never fully adopted the Hunnic style of warfare, the encounters undoubtedly led to a greater appreciation for cavalry and missile tactics. The image of the Hunnic horse archer, a whirlwind of death and destruction, became an archetype of nomadic warfare that would influence military thinking for centuries. Historians still argue whether the Hunnic impact was truly unique, or if they were simply the most successful of many steppe peoples who periodically threatened settled empires. However, their specific timing coinciding with the internal weaknesses of the Roman Empire and the sheer scale and terror of their campaigns undeniably set them apart. They were a force that accelerated decline, broke established patterns, and initiated new historical trajectories. They didn't just participate in history, they drove it, often with a whip and a bow. In essence, the Huns left behind not an empire of stone and law, but a legacy etched into the very fabric of European society. They cleared the way for new political entities, contributed to the fall of a mighty empire, and burned themselves into the collective memory of a continent. Even without a lasting physical presence or a direct line of descent into modern nations, their impact reverberates through the historical narrative. Their story is a powerful reminder of the profound influence a dynamic, nomadic power can have on seemingly immutable, settled civilizations, demonstrating that sometimes the greatest changes come from the most unexpected and terrifying directions. Beyond the political and demographic upheaval they unleashed, the Huns also possessed a distinctive culture and mode of warfare that profoundly shaped their interactions with the settled world and contributed to their fearsome reputation. To the Romans and other settled peoples, the Hunnic lifestyle seemed utterly alien, almost incomprehensible, defined as it was by constant movement and a lack of fixed settlements. This fundamental difference in lifestyle was not just a curiosity. It was the very source of their military strength and their ability to terrify their adversaries. At the heart of Hunnic culture was their profound connection to the horse. For the Huns, the horse was not merely a beast of burden or a tool of war. It was an extension of their very being. They lived, traveled, hunted, and fought from horseback. Their children were reportedly taught to ride almost as soon as they could walk, often strapped to the backs of ponies, developing an innate sense of balance and coordination that astounded their Roman counterparts. Imagine learning to ride before you learn to read, and you'll get a sense of their priorities. This intimate relationship with their mounts allowed them to perform feats of equestrian skill that seemed almost supernatural to those accustomed to slower moving cavalry or static infantry formations. Their famous horsemanship enabled their unique military tactics. The Huns were primarily mounted archers, a fighting style that they brought to a peak of terrifying efficiency. Their primary weapon was the composite bow, a sophisticated and powerful weapon crafted from layers of wood, horn, and animal sinew glued together to create immense tension. This bow, often relatively short and therefore usable from horseback, could launch arrows with incredible velocity and accuracy, capable of piercing Roman armor. Unlike the simple wooden bows of many European peoples, the composite bow was a complex piece of engineering, requiring specialized knowledge and materials. A Hunnic warrior could loose a volley of arrows, reload, and fire again with astonishing speed, showering an enemy with deadly projectiles from a distance. Hunnic battle tactics revolved around speed, mobility, and feigned retreats. They would typically open an engagement with relentless volleys of arrows, harassing and softening up enemy formations from a distance, never allowing their opponents to close to hand combat on their own terms. If a charge was attempted against them, they would often perform a feigned retreat, scattering and drawing their pursuers into a disorganized chase, only to suddenly turn, regroup, and unleash another barrage of arrows or envelop the confused enemy. This tactic, requiring immense discipline and coordination, was incredibly demoralizing for their opponents, who often found themselves fighting ghosts in a swirling dust cloud. When direct engagement was unavoidable, the Huns also utilized lances, swords, and lassos, demonstrating their versatility in close combat. However, their strength lay in their ability to avoid sustained, pitched battles of attrition, preferring to outmaneuver and demoralize their enemies before delivering the decisive blow. They were masters of psychological warfare, using their terrifying reputation and rapid movements to induce panic and disarray. A Roman legionnaire, accustomed to fighting in tight formations, would have found the Hunnic style of warfare utterly baffling and terrifyingly effective. It was like trying to punch smoke, a frustrating and ultimately futile exercise. Their nomadic lifestyle also gave them a significant logistical advantage. Unlike settled armies, which required elaborate supply lines and fixed bases, the Huns were largely self-sufficient. They carried their homes, yurts, with them, could live off their herds, and required minimal provisions from outside sources, except for luxury goods or metals. This allowed them to cover vast distances with incredible speed and to operate in territories that would have been logistically impossible for Roman armies. They could strike deep into enemy territory, ravage it, and then vanish as quickly as they appeared, leaving their bewildered opponents struggling to react. Their diet primarily consisted of meat and milk products, obtained from their vast herds of horses, cattle, and sheep. While stories of them tenderizing meat under their saddles might be apocryphal, they certainly consumed dried meats and fermented mare's milk, kumis, which provided them with a highly mobile and energy-rich food source. Their clothing was practical and suited to their equestrian lifestyle, typically consisting of leather or felt tunics, trousers, and boots, allowing for maximum freedom of movement in the saddle. They were not known for their sartorial elegance, but rather for their pragmatic, war-ready attire. From a social and political perspective, the Hunnic Confederation, particularly under Attila, was a meritocracy of sorts, though still bound by tribal loyalties. Leadership was often based on a combination of lineage, personal prowess in battle, and strategic acumen. Attila's rise to supreme power, even at the cost of his brother's life, illustrates the importance of singular, effective leadership in a nomadic empire. The loyalty of the diverse subject tribes was maintained through a system of fear, tribute, and the promise of shared plunder from successful campaigns. It was a rather robust system of what's in it for me for a warrior culture. Historians still argue about the extent to which the Huns possessed a sophisticated administrative structure beyond their military organization. While they collected vast amounts of tribute and managed large numbers of subjugated peoples, they did not establish permanent cities, elaborate legal codes, or complex bureaucratic systems akin to the Romans. Their empire was more of a mobile war machine, an incredibly effective instrument for extracting wealth and power from settled civilizations, rather than a state designed for long-term territorial administration. This distinction highlights their unique nature. They were a force of disruption, not construction. The Roman fascination with the Huns extended to their physical appearance, which was often described in unflattering and prejudiced terms by Roman authors. They were depicted as short, broad-shouldered, with flat noses and small, piercing eyes. These descriptions, combined with their foreign language and fearsome reputation, contributed to the Roman perception of them as utterly barbaric and inhuman. However, these portrayals must be taken with a grain of salt, as they were often designed to demonize the enemy and reinforce Roman cultural superiority. In essence, the Huns were a perfectly adapted nomadic war machine, honed by centuries of steppe life. Their culture was intrinsically linked to their military effectiveness, their horses, their bows, their mobility, and their ability to live off the land. These attributes allowed them to sweep across Europe with unprecedented speed and destructive power, fundamentally altering the course of history through their unique mode of warfare. They proved that even the most established and powerful empires could be humbled by a force that understood the art of rapid, unpredictable, and overwhelming violence, a truly timeless lesson in military strategy. While the written accounts of the Huns, largely penned by their Roman adversaries, offer tantalizing glimpses into their world, they are often colored by fear and bias, presenting a somewhat one-dimensional view of a terrifying, destructive force. Thankfully, in recent decades, archaeological discoveries have begun to shed new and fascinating light on Hunnic life, providing tangible evidence that complements and sometimes challenges the literary records. These unearthed artifacts and burial sites are like dusty puzzle pieces, slowly but surely helping historians to reconstruct a more complete picture of this enigmatic people. It's almost as if the earth itself is whispering secrets that the ancient texts deliberately kept hidden or simply didn't know. Archaeological investigations across the vast expanse of the Eurasian steppe, particularly in regions corresponding to the Hunnic heartland in modern-day Hungary, Ukraine, and other parts of Eastern Europe, have yielded significant finds. These discoveries range from everyday tools and personal adornments to elaborate burial sites, each offering unique insights into their material culture, social structures, and even their beliefs. These findings help to move beyond the purely martial descriptions and offer a more nuanced understanding of how the Huns lived when they weren't, shall we say, actively engaged in international relations. One of the most characteristic and widespread archaeological finds associated with the Huns are their distinctive arrowheads. These are often small, trilobed or pyramidal in shape, and made of iron or bone. Their design was optimized for penetration and mass production, perfectly suited for the rapid, devastating volleys of their mounted archers. The sheer number of these arrowheads found at various sites, particularly battlefields or siege locations, speaks volumes about the Huns' reliance on archery as their primary mode of combat. Finding these scattered across ancient fields is like finding spent cartridges at a modern firing range, a clear indication of intense activity. Another significant area of discovery involves Hunnic burial sites. Unlike settled peoples who often built elaborate tombs or necropolises, Hunnic burials typically involved simple, shallow graves. However, the grave goods found within these burials are often quite revealing. These frequently include weapons, such as bows, or parts thereof, arrows, and the characteristic Hunnic longswords, which were single-edged and designed for use from horseback. The presence of elaborate horse harnesses, bits, and riding gear also underscores the importance of the horse in their afterlife, mirroring its central role in their earthly existence. Perhaps even more intriguing are the discoveries of gold and silver artifacts in Hunnic graves. These range from intricate belt buckles and decorative plaques to drinking vessels and ornate jewelry. What's particularly noteworthy is that many of these precious objects are clearly of Roman or Sasanian, Persian manufacture, often deliberately broken or ritually killed before being buried with the deceased. This provides direct archaeological evidence of the immense wealth the Huns accumulated through tribute, plunder, and trade with the settled empires. It also shows a fascinating blend of cultures, where foreign luxuries were incorporated into their own nomadic rituals. It's like finding a Roman emperor's tea set in a humble tent, albeit one belonging to a very powerful individual. The practice of skull deformation is another curious aspect that archaeology has illuminated about the Huns. Many Hunnic skeletal remains show evidence of artificial cranial deformation, where infants' heads were tightly bound to produce an elongated shape. This practice, common among various steppe peoples, was likely a marker of tribal identity, status, or perhaps even a form of beauty. While Roman sources briefly mention the Huns' deformed heads, archaeological findings confirm the widespread nature of this practice among them and some of their allied tribes, offering a unique physical identifier for some Hunnic populations. The study of Hunnic settlements, or rather their encampments, also provides insights. As nomads, the Huns did not build permanent cities or extensive stone structures. Their camps were typically composed of portable yurts, felt tents, and temporary wooden structures. Archaeological excavations of these sites reveal traces of campfires, refused pits, and the remains of livestock, offering clues about their daily lives, diet, and seasonal movements. While not as visually impressive as Roman ruins, these subtle archaeological footprints tell their own story of a mobile society. Historians still argue whether Attila's famous court in Pannonia had more substantial wooden buildings, but the evidence suggests a preference for structures that could be easily dismantled and moved, reflecting their fundamentally nomadic identity. Recent genetic studies on ancient human remains attributed to the Hunnic period are also beginning to contribute to our understanding of their origins and migrations. While still in its early stages, this emerging field of archaeogenetics promises to provide more definitive answers to questions about their ancestral ties to the Xiongnu and the ethnic composition of their confederation. It's like DNA testing for ancient civilizations, slowly revealing familial connections across millennia. However, the archaeological record for the Huns remains challenging to interpret fully. Their nomadic lifestyle meant they left fewer permanent markers than settled civilizations, and much of their wealth was either perishable or redistributed. Furthermore, the term Hunnic in the archaeological context can sometimes refer to the material culture of the broader Hunnic Confederation, including the Germanic and other allied tribes, making it difficult to precisely distinguish between what is ethnically Hunnic and what was adopted by or belonged to their diverse subjects. It's a bit like trying to categorize every single item found in a modern shopping mall and attributing it to the nationality of the store owner. Despite these challenges, archaeological research has significantly enriched our understanding of the Huns, moving beyond the simplistic Roman portrayals of them as purely destructive forces. It reveals a complex, adaptable people with sophisticated military technology, a pragmatic approach to acquiring wealth, and a distinct material culture that reflected their nomadic existence. These quiet discoveries beneath the earth are providing the physical proof of a people who once commanded a vast, terrifying empire, reminding us that history is not just found in books, but also in the silent whispers of the soil. The sheer terror and awe inspired by the Huns, and particularly by Attila, did not vanish with the collapse of their empire at Nidau. On the contrary, their dramatic impact on the Roman world and their formidable reputation ensured their enduring presence in legend and literature for centuries to come. They transformed from historical figures into mythical archetypes, embodying everything from divine punishment to fierce, almost superhuman warriors. It's almost as if the collective European subconscious decided that such a powerful and destructive force simply had to have a story that transcended mere historical fact, making them larger than life, a truly timeless brand of terror. In the immediate aftermath of their invasions, Roman and Byzantine chroniclers continued to describe the Huns with a mix of horror and grudging admiration. They were often referred to as the scourge of God, flagellum Dei, a chilling epithet that cast Attila as an instrument of divine wrath, sent to punish the sins of humanity. This religious interpretation of their invasions provided a framework for understanding the seemingly inexplicable devastation they wrought, offering a spiritual explanation for a very earthly catastrophe. It also conveniently sidestepped the awkward question of Roman military weakness by simply blaming it on divine intervention. As the centuries progressed, particularly in the early medieval period, the figure of Attila began to take on different forms in the epic poems and heroic sagas of the Germanic peoples he had once conquered. One of the most famous examples is the Nibelungenlied, a medieval German epic poem written around the 12th century. In this saga, Attila appears as Etzel, a powerful king of the Huns, but one who is often portrayed in a surprisingly positive, almost sympathetic light. He is depicted as a magnanimous host, a just ruler, at least to his own people, and a man of great wealth, who ironically becomes involved in the tragic downfall of the Burgundians, rather than being their direct antagonist. This portrayal stands in stark contrast to the destructive, terror-inducing figure of Roman historical accounts. It's a bit like watching a villain from one story become a somewhat bumbling, yet still powerful, supporting character in another, shedding some of his menace along the way. Historians still argue about why Attila's character underwent such a transformation in Germanic legend. Some suggest it was a result of the passage of time, allowing the raw fear to fade and be replaced by a romanticized view of a powerful warrior king. Others believe it reflects the reality that many Germanic tribes were, for a time, subjects or allies of the Huns, and thus their legends might incorporate a more nuanced, less demonized view of their former overlords. Perhaps it was also a way for these emerging Germanic peoples to connect themselves to a powerful, prestigious past, however fearsome. In Norse sagas, particularly those from Iceland, Attila appears as Atli. Here, he is often depicted as a greedy and treacherous king, particularly in the Atlakvida, Lay of Atli, and the Atlamal, Ballad of Atli. These poems recount the tragic tale of the Burgundians, here called Niflungs, and their ultimate destruction at the hands of Atli and his Huns, often driven by Atli's desire for their treasure. While still a powerful figure, this portrayal reintroduces an element of cunning and malice, closer to the Roman perception, yet still rooted in a world of heroic, if violent, deeds. It's as if different cultures had their own favorite version of the story, adjusting the villain's motivations to fit their own narrative needs. The Huns, as a collective, also became a symbol of barbarian chaos and destruction in later European literature and art. Their image, often exaggerated, served as a powerful reminder of the fragility of civilization and the ever-present threat from the wild peoples beyond the borders. This perception of the Huns as the quintessential other, the ultimate bringers of chaos, lingered for centuries, influencing how European societies viewed nomadic peoples in general. In Hungary, a curious twist of fate tied the Huns to later national identity. From the medieval period onwards, Hungarian chronicles and legends began to assert a direct genealogical link between the Huns and the Magyars, the ancestors of modern Hungarians. This largely mythical connection, popularized by works like the Gesta Hungarorum, served to provide the Hungarian kingdom with a prestigious, powerful, and fearsome ancestry, allowing them to claim direct descent from Attila himself. This claim, while lacking solid historical or archaeological basis, became deeply ingrained in Hungarian national consciousness, making Attila a celebrated, almost heroic figure in their national mythology. It's a classic example of how nations construct their own narratives, sometimes blurring the lines between historical fact and legendary aspiration. Even into more modern times, the Huns and Attila continue to appear in popular culture, in novels, films, and video games, often as formidable antagonists or symbols of overwhelming force. The imagery of the mounted archer, the vast, terrifying horde, and the ruthless, unstoppable leader has resonated across generations, a testament to the enduring power of their historical impact and the captivating nature of their story. Historians still argue about the ethical responsibility of a narrative to distinguish clearly between historical facts and later legendary embellishments, especially when those legends take on a life of their own and become deeply intertwined with national identities. The Huns, more than many other ancient peoples, demonstrate this challenge beautifully. Their very silence in the archaeological record, combined with the vivid, often conflicting written accounts, created a fertile ground for the imagination to take root, transforming a historical nightmare into a captivating, multifaceted legend. The real Huns, nomadic warriors of the steppe, were formidable enough, but the Huns of legend, etched into the collective memory, became something even grander and more enduring, a testament to the human need to create powerful stories from the chaotic tapestry of the past. Despite the vivid, often terrifying accounts of the Huns left by Roman chroniclers and the fascinating transformations of their story in later legends, the historical record regarding this enigmatic people remains frustratingly incomplete. For historians, piecing together the true story of the Huns is often like trying to complete a massive jigsaw puzzle with most of the pieces missing, and the ones you do have are a bit smudged. This scarcity of definitive primary sources and the inherent biases of the surviving accounts pose significant historiographical challenges, leaving many aspects of Hunnic society, motivations, and ultimate fate open to scholarly debate and continuous reevaluation. One of the most fundamental challenges is the sheer lack of indigenous Hunnic written records. Unlike the Romans or the Chinese, the Huns were a nomadic people, and their culture did not develop a system of writing or monumental inscriptions. Their history was passed down orally through sagas and songs, which are now lost to time. This means that almost everything we know about them comes from the perspective of their enemies or those they encountered, primarily Roman, Byzantine, and Chinese sources. These accounts, while invaluable, are inherently biased, often exaggerating their ferocity, understating their political sophistication, and focusing on their destructive impact rather than their internal dynamics. It's a bit like trying to understand a football team by only reading the highly critical commentary from the opposing side's fan club. The very identity of the Huns remains a subject of ongoing debate. Were they directly descended from the Xiongnu, a powerful nomadic confederation that tormented the Han dynasty in China centuries earlier? Or were they a new ethnogenesis, a coalition of various steppe peoples who came together under a new leadership and adopted a Hunnic identity as they moved westward? While strong linguistic and archaeological links suggest a connection, The precise nature of this relationship is still discussed. The lack of their own language records, beyond a few names recorded by Roman sources, further complicates efforts to trace their origins definitively. The composition of the Hunnic Empire itself is another complex issue. Was it a truly unified empire under a centralized authority, or a loose confederation of diverse tribes held together primarily by the charismatic leadership of figures like Attila and the shared pursuit of plunder? Roman sources often portray it as a monolithic force, but archaeological evidence and analysis of their military tactics suggest a more fluid and multi-ethnic entity. Understanding the internal dynamics between the Hunnic core and their numerous subjugated Germanic, Slavic, and Atlantic allies is crucial for a complete picture, yet direct evidence is scarce. It's like trying to diagram the organizational chart of a sprawling, constantly moving conglomerate with no HR department. The nature of Hunnic governance also presents a challenge. Given their nomadic lifestyle, how did they administer such vast territories and control so many diverse peoples? The answer seems to be through a system of fear, tribute, and direct military presence, rather than through complex bureaucratic structures or fixed administrative centers. Attila's court in Pannonia, as described by Priscus, was more of a large, mobile encampment than a settled capital. Historians still grapple with the practicalities of how such an extensive, non-territorial empire functioned on a day-to-day basis beyond mere conquest. The motivations behind their invasions are also debated. Were they solely driven by a desire for plunder and tribute, or did they harbor grander strategic ambitions, such as establishing a permanent empire in Europe? Attila's actions suggest a strong emphasis on wealth extraction and military dominance, rather than long-term territorial occupation or cultural assimilation. However, understanding the internal pressures within the Hunnic Confederation, such as population growth, environmental factors on the steppe, or internal tribal conflicts that might have spurred their westward migrations, remains difficult to ascertain with certainty. Perhaps one of the most enduring mysteries is the ultimate fate of the Huns themselves. After the Battle of Nidau and the collapse of their empire, the Hunnic core seems to have largely vanished from the historical record in Europe. Some dispersed fragments may have retreated back eastward, assimilating into other nomadic groups on the steppes. Others likely remained in Europe, gradually intermarrying and being absorbed into the larger Germanic or Slavic populations. There is no clear, distinct Hunnic people existing in Europe after the 5th century. This rapid disappearance makes tracing their long-term genetic and cultural legacy particularly challenging, a true vanishing act. Historians also contend with the heroic and villainous portrayals of the Huns in later literature and national mythologies. As we discussed, Attila transformed from the scourge of God to a semi-heroic figure in some Germanic sagas and a national ancestor in Hungarian lore. Disentangling these layers of legend and propaganda from the historical facts requires careful critical analysis, ensuring that modern interpretations are not unduly swayed by romanticized or demonized narratives. It's a constant effort to separate the terrifying reality from the compelling storytelling. Despite these significant challenges, the study of the Huns continues to evolve. New archaeological discoveries, as discussed, are providing crucial non-literary evidence. Advances in ancient DNA analysis hold the promise of shedding more light on their origins and genetic relationships. And rigorous re-examination of existing texts, coupled with comparative studies of other nomadic empires, allows historians to draw more nuanced conclusions about their unique place in history. The Huns remain a fascinating, if elusive, subject, a powerful reminder of the limits of our knowledge about the ancient world and the enduring allure of its many unsolved mysteries. The quest to fully understand them continues, driven by the persistent whispers of a terrifying yet captivating past. As we draw towards the quiet close of this vast story, a profound truth emerges about the Huns. For all their historical impact and the lingering terror of their name, they remain in many ways an enigma. The challenges of understanding them, which we've gently explored, are not just academic hurdles. They are fundamental limitations imposed by the very nature of their existence and the haphazard way history is recorded. This final reflection on their story brings us face to face with the enduring historiographical challenges and mysteries that continue to surround them, much like trying to grasp smoke with your bare hands. The most significant and persistent mystery, as we've frequently noted, is the lack of a Hunnic voice in their own narrative. We hear them only through the ears of their enemies, primarily the Roman and Byzantine chroniclers, like Priscus, Jordanus, and Ammianus Marcellinus. These sources, while invaluable, are inherently biased. They filter events through a lens of fear, prejudice, and a desire to demonize the barbarian other. Imagine trying to understand a complex political movement solely from the propaganda pamphlets of its bitterest rival. You'd get a picture, certainly, but perhaps not the full, nuanced truth. This means much of what we accept as Hunnic history is in fact Roman perception of Hunnic history, a crucial distinction that historians must constantly grapple with. This absence of internal records extends to fundamental aspects of their society. We know very little about their internal political structures beyond the names of a few prominent leaders or the precise nature of their legal systems, if indeed they had formal ones. Their spiritual beliefs, their artistic expressions, their everyday rituals, all these facets of a rich culture are largely lost to us or inferred only from sparse archaeological remains. It's like looking at a grand ancient tapestry where only a few threads remain and you're left to guess the original pattern. The very origins of the Huns continue to be a subject of intense debate. While the Xiongnu connection is the most widely accepted hypothesis, it is still a hypothesis. The precise path of their migration from the East Asian steppes to Europe, the various groups they absorbed, and the factors that propelled them westward remain areas of active research. Was it climatic change, pressure from other nomadic groups, or simply the irresistible pull of richer lands? Historians still argue whether their initial movements were a desperate flight or a calculated expansion, a fundamental question with no easy answers. It's a bit like trying to trace the precise trajectory of a pebble thrown into a vast ocean. The ripples are clear, but the initial splash point is elusive. Then there is the perplexing question of the size and composition of Attila's army. Roman accounts often cite numbers that stretch into the hundreds of thousands, truly astronomical figures for the time. While Attila's army was undoubtedly massive and multi-ethnic, incorporating a multitude of subjugated tribes, these numbers are likely exaggerated for dramatic effect or to underscore the perceived miraculous nature of Roman survival. Accurately estimating the true scale of his forces and the precise proportion of Huns to allied tribes remains a significant challenge, crucial for understanding their military capabilities and logistical feats. It's tough to get an accurate head count when everyone is moving so quickly and trying to kill you. The motivations behind Attila's specific campaigns, particularly his decision to invade Gaul and then Italy, also spark continuous discussion. Was the lure of Honoria's dowry genuine or a convenient pretext? Was his retreat from Italy truly due to papal intervention, disease, and Eastern Roman pressure, or a combination of factors, with Attila simply deciding the gains were no longer worth the cost? The historian must weigh conflicting accounts, consider pragmatic factors, and resist the temptation to embrace the most dramatic or emotionally satisfying narrative. Perhaps the greatest mystery of all is the swift and complete disappearance of the Huns as a distinct entity after the Battle of Nidau. Unlike other barbarian groups who established lasting kingdoms, like the Goths or Franks, the Hunnic core simply faded from the historical record in Europe. Where did they go? Did they completely assimilate into other tribes, or did some remnants retreat back into the Eurasian steppe, ultimately to be absorbed by other nomadic groups? The lack of any clear, continuous line of descent or a distinct Hunnic population in later centuries makes their historical dissolution a unique phenomenon, a sudden implosion that defies easy explanation. It's as if they rode off into the sunset, and then the sunset simply swallowed them whole. The nature of their empire itself is still debated. Was it a true political entity, or merely a vast, temporary military confederation held together by the personal power of its leader and the promise of plunder? Their lack of permanent cities, extensive bureaucracy, or codified laws distinguishes them sharply from the settled empires they so effectively challenged. This makes their categorization difficult, forcing historians to reconsider traditional definitions of empire when applied to nomadic powers. In the end, the Huns remain a powerful reminder of the inherent limitations of historical reconstruction, especially when dealing with non-literate societies. Their story is pieced together from fragments, hints, and the often terrified observations of their adversaries. Yet it is precisely this mystery, this tantalizing absence of a complete picture, that makes them so endlessly fascinating. They were a fleeting but utterly transformative force, a whirlwind of horse and arrow that swept across a continent, leaving behind a legacy of destruction, fear, and 1,000 unanswered questions. Their story, perpetually shrouded in mist, compels us to keep searching, to keep listening for the faint echoes of their hooves on the ancient plains, a testament to a power that truly reshaped the world before vanishing almost without a trace. And so, as the final echoes of the Hunnic hooves fade into the stillness of the past, we find ourselves at the edge of a deep quiet. The thundering armies, the shouts of battle, the anxious whispers in Roman courts, They all soften now, becoming indistinct murmurs, like distant wind sighing through ancient grasslands. The sun has truly set on their nomadic ride across Europe, their power, once so absolute, dissolving back into the vastness from which it arose. Their story, dramatic and impactful, has gently unspooled, revealing a world irrevocably changed by their fleeting presence. We are left not with answers to every question, but with the quiet contemplation of how such a force could rise, dominate, and then simply fade. Let that gentle stillness, that quiet descent into the past, carry you into a restful slumber. The great historical journey is complete for tonight, and all that remains is the soft echo of a world long gone.